Chapter 1. Bloomsbury, London, England. 1857. London had taken to ghosts that autumn. Not the honest kind that haunted graveyards, but the fashionable sort that answered through a medium's trembling hand. It was, after all, the eve of All Hallows, the night when even the sensible left a candle burning for company. Clara Wetherly stood in the back room of Hawthorne and Wetherly, carefully measuring dried chamomile flowers into small muslin bags. Tomorrow was All Saints' Day, and half of Bloomsbury would want soothing teas for their post-Halloween nerves. The methodical work usually calmed her, but today each measurement felt like marking time until evening, an evening she'd rather avoid entirely. The shop bell chimed with excessive enthusiasm. "Clara, my dear girl, where are you hiding?" Mrs. Agatha Penfield's voice carried the particular pitch of excitement that meant Clara's quiet afternoon was about to be thoroughly disrupted. She set down her scales, brushed dried flowers from her apron, and emerged through the curtain. Mrs. Penfield stood in the centre of the shop, like a general surveying a battlefield, her steel-grey curls trembling with enthusiasm beneath a bonnet trimmed in purple ribbons. Her eyes sparkled with the sort of delight that usually preceded Clara being volunteered for something. "There you are!" "Oh, Clara, the most wonderful news!" Mrs. Penfield swept toward the counter, practically vibrating. "I've done it! I've actually secured her!" "Secured whom?" Clara asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know. "Madame Seraphina Vale. The Madame Seraphina Vale. She's agreed to conduct a séance at my home this very evening. Even Lady Rothschild couldn't book her, but I managed through my cousin Colonel Blackwood. Apparently she owed him a favour from his time in Brighton." Mrs. Penfield beamed with triumph. 10 guests, a proper circle on All Hallows Eve itself. Clara returned to her measuring. "How thrilling for you!" "Oh, no, not just for me. You're coming?" "I'm afraid I have Clara Wetherly." Mrs. Penfield's tone shifted from excited to commanding. "When did you last attend any social gathering that didn't involve a corpse?" Clara paused mid-measure. "That's hardly—" "You're 27, not 70. You spend every evening in this shop with your cat and your tinctures." Mrs. Penfield leaned across the counter. "Your grandmother, God rest her, would be appalled to see you living like a hermit. Grandmother appreciated solitude. Genevieve appreciated balance. She also attended séances, if I recall correctly. Thought they were nonsense, but she went for the society." Mrs. Penfield's expression softened slightly. "Besides, I need you. Mrs. Turner has taken ill, something about bad oysters, and I need a 10th person for the circle. 9 is completely wrong for the energies, according to Madame Seraphina." Clara sighed. "Mrs. Penfield, and before you claim you have nothing to wear, that grey silk you wore to the Thornfield dinner is perfectly appropriate. And bring some of that nice incense, the sandalwood blend that doesn't make me sneeze. Madame Seraphina specifically requested atmospheric enhancement." "I don't—" "Plus," Mrs. Penfield's eyes gleamed with strategic cunning, "Mrs. Evangeline Pettigrew will be there. Recently widowed, extremely wealthy, and in desperate need of quality herbal remedies for her nerves. She could become your best customer if properly introduced." Clara felt her resistance weakening. Business had been slower than usual this month. "It's just like in The Spiritualist's Secret," Mrs. Penfield continued, warming to her theme. "You know, where the heroine attends the séance and meets her future. Well, never mind that part. The point is she thought it would be dreadful, but it changed her entire life." "That was fiction, Mrs. Penfield." "Fiction based on truth. Besides, what else were you planning? Sitting here grinding herbs while all of London celebrates All Hallows Eve?" She straightened, adjusting her gloves with finality. 9 o'clock sharp. The séance begins at 9:30. Apparently the veil is thinnest as we approach midnight. Clara recognised defeat. "Who else will be attending?" "Oh, a fascinating mix. My cousin, Colonel Blackwood. A bit of a bore, but he brings military dignity. Mrs. Winters and Miss Collins, of course. That young Miss Harwick that everyone's talking about. Some scandal with an engagement, terribly exciting. Dr. Waverley, who's writing a paper on spiritualism and medical science. Mr. Crane, who manages Mrs. Pettigrew's affairs. And a few others, all very respectable, I assure you. She swept toward the door, her mission accomplished. 9 o'clock, Clara. Don't be late, and do try to look less sceptical. It ages one terribly. The bell chimed again as she departed, leaving Clara alone with the lingering scent of Mrs. Penfield's lavender water. Clara moved to the window, watching her neighbour navigate the cobblestones with remarkable agility. As she turned back to her work, something caught her eye. A figure across the street, standing between the bookbinder's and the millinery. A woman in a travelling cloak, too formal for afternoon shopping, stood perfectly still. She appeared to be studying the shop's facade with peculiar intensity. Clara had noticed her before, yesterday and perhaps the day before that, always passing by, slowing near the door, never entering. Today she simply stood and watched. Clara stepped closer to the window, but the woman turned abruptly and walked away, her pace quick and theatrical, as if exiting a stage. Odd, Clara murmured. From his cushion by the window, Marmalade opened one golden eye, then closed it again with feline dismissal. Whatever the woman wanted, it clearly didn't concern him.
Marmalade's observations, in which humans fail to notice the obvious, and I am forced to intervene. The skulker was back, 3rd time this week. Clara, naturally, had only just noticed her. Humans, their observational skills were appalling. All that height, and they still missed what was directly in front of them. I'd catalogued the woman properly, as any respectable cat would. Tuesday. She'd paused at our door, hand actually on the handle, then fled when Mrs. Winters emerged from the millinery. Wednesday. She'd circled the block twice, slowing each time she passed our window. Today, bold enough to stand and stare, at least until the Penfield woman's assault scared her off. The interesting part wasn't her watching. It was her shoes. Stage shoes, the kind that made no sound when she wanted them silent, but could create dramatic clicks when needed. I'd seen them on the theatre, people who sometimes bought Clara's headache remedies. This one was performing even when she thought no one was watching. The Penfield woman's social invasion had distracted Clara from the obvious questions. Why would someone study our shop like a script to be memorized? What kind of person needed to rehearse entering an apothecary? The answer would be at tonight's séance. I was certain of it. Which was why, when Clara returned dressed in that grey silk that made her look like a governess, I was ready. She reached for her shawl. I sat on it. Marmalade, move. I remained immobile, dignified, immovable. I need my shawl. I yawned, displaying my superior fangs. Then I walked to the door and sat before it, tail swishing with clear intent. Absolutely not. You cannot come to Mrs. Penfield's séance. I had anticipated this resistance. Humans always assumed their social gatherings were too sophisticated for cats, as if we weren't the ones who invented proper séance atmosphere. Mysterious sounds, objects moving without explanation, sudden cold spots. Please, cats had been doing this for centuries. I simply walked to her feet and wound around her ankles, purring. Then back to the door. The message was clear. I was coming, or she'd spend the next hour trying to detach me from her skirts. You truly want to come? Clara asked, and I heard the softness in her voice. She never could resist when I made my intentions clear. It will be dreadfully boring. Nothing but humans play-acting at speaking with spirits. I rubbed against her ankle again, purring louder. Someone had to keep watch. The skulker would be there. I could feel it in my whiskers. And Clara, brilliant with herbs but hopeless with human deception, would need my superior observational skills. Besides, the Penfield woman would be delighted. She'd probably insist I be given my own cushion at the séance table.
Clara collected her packet of incense and her grandmother's black wool shawl. She looked down at Marmalade. who sat by the door with an air of patient expectation. "Well then," she said, a small smile touching her lips, "if you're determined to suffer through an evening of theatrical nonsense with me, who am I to refuse? Though I warn you there will be no salmon. Only dramatic gasping and probably some very bad tea." Marmalade strutted out the door ahead of her, tail high, the picture of feline dignity. As if he cared about salmon when there was a mystery afoot. Outside, fog was beginning to creep up from the Thames, transforming familiar Bloomsbury into something altogether different. Gas lamps created pools of yellow light that seemed to float in the grey mist. She locked the shop carefully, Marmalade at her heels like a small orange shadow. The church bells of St. Giles began to toll, 8 long peals that echoed through the fog. "At least I'll have one sensible companion tonight," Clara murmured, glancing down at him with genuine affection, "though Mrs. Penfield will probably insist you're my familiar. She's been reading those dreadful Gothic novels again." Marmalade made a small chirrup of agreement. The Penfield woman's literary tastes were indeed questionable, but at least she had the good sense to appreciate a superior cat when she saw one. They set off toward Mrs. Penfield's residence, directly across the street. Clara could see the windows already glowing with extra lamplight. Mrs. Penfield had clearly been preparing all day for her grand séance. "The advantage," Clara murmured to Marmalade, "is that we won't have far to retreat when this becomes unbearable." Behind them, from somewhere in the fog-shrouded street, footsteps echoed briefly before fading toward the square. Marmalade's ears swivelled backward, his fur rising slightly along his spine. Clara noticed his sudden alertness and paused. "What is it?" She trusted his instincts completely. They'd served her well before. But the footsteps had already faded into the fog. Marmalade relaxed his posture slightly and continued walking, though he kept one ear rotated backward. "Someone else heading to the séance, perhaps," Clara said softly, "taking the long way around to avoid arriving with us." How curious. Together they crossed the cobbled street and approached Mrs. Penfield's door, one sceptical woman and one highly observant cat, walking toward a séance that would prove far more dramatic than either of them anticipated. After all, on All Hallows Eve, even the dead like to make an entrance. Chapter 2. Clara stood in Mrs. Penfield's entrance hall, trying not to stare at the theatrical excess of All Hallows Eve decorations. Black crape draped every surface, paper bats dangled from the gas fixtures, and no fewer than 6 carved turnips leered from various corners, their candles casting dancing shadows on the wallpaper. "Isn't it wonderfully atmospheric?" Mrs. Penfield beamed, practically vibrating with excitement. "Just like the spectre of Grosvenor Square. You know, where the heroine arrives at the haunted mansion, and it's certainly thorough," Clara managed, setting Marmalade down. He immediately stalked toward the sitting room, tail high, as if he owned the establishment. Mrs. Winters emerged from the parlour, clutching her reticule like a shield. "Clara, thank goodness you're here. I've brought smelling salts just in case the spirits prove overwhelming." She lowered her voice to a dramatic whisper. "Miss Collins is already taking notes. She's convinced tonight will be just like the Brighton Séance murders." Miss Collins herself appeared, notebook in hand, spectacles sliding down her nose. "The medium always dies first in that one, you know. Most peculiar pattern. I've been documenting the atmospheric conditions, temperature, humidity, supernatural emanations." "There are no supernatural emanations," Clara said gently. "Not yet," Miss Collins replied with alarming cheerfulness. The doorbell chimed and Mrs. Penfield rushed to answer it herself, too excited to wait for her maid. "That will be Mrs. Pettigrew and Mr. Crane." The widow who entered looked exactly as Clara had expected, draped in expensive mourning, her face drawn with genuine grief. The man beside her, however, made Clara pause. Mr. Silas Crane was a study in nervous energy. his fingers tapping against his pocket watch chain in an irregular rhythm. "This is Mr. Crane, my invaluable business manager," Mrs. Pettigrew said, her voice thin with exhaustion. "I don't make a decision without him since dear Harold passed." "I merely handle the tedious financial matters," Crane said quickly, his eyes darting around the room as if calculating the value of the furnishings. Mrs. Penfield fluttered about them. "How wonderful that you could join us, Mr. Crane. I wasn't sure you'd be interested in spiritual matters." Mrs. Pettigrew insisted. He pulled out his pocket watch, checked it, and returned it in one fluid motion, a gesture Clara noticed he'd already repeated twice since entering. "I accompany her most evenings for her safety." "Such devotion," Mrs. Winters murmured, though her tone suggested she found it more suspicious than admirable. The next arrival was Colonel Blackwood, Mrs. Penfield's cousin from Surrey. He entered with military bearing, his posture stiff as his starched collar. "Lot of nonsense, if you ask me," he announced to no one in particular, "but family obligations and all that." He surveyed the decorations with obvious distaste. "Good Lord, Agatha, did you buy out every penny bazaar in London?" "Oh, Reginald, don't be such a bore," Mrs. Penfield scolded. "It's All Hallows Eve. One must set the proper tone." Miss Victoria Harwick arrived next, a pretty young thing who seemed determined to disappear into the wallpaper. She flinched when introduced, avoided eye contact, and clutched her gloves as if they might provide escape. Clara heard Mrs. Winters whisper something about a broken engagement and quite the scandal to Miss Collins, who immediately began scribbling. Dr. Josiah Waverley made an entrance worthy of a stage production, sweeping in with his cape still swirling from the fog outside. "Ladies, gentlemen, what a thrilling evening for scientific inquiry." He produced a small notebook with a flourish. "I'm documenting this for the Royal Medical Society, you understand. The intersection of spiritualism and medical science. Fascinating stuff. The psychological implications alone." "Doctor," Colonel Blackwood interrupted, "we're not specimens." "Oh, but we are!" Waverley's eyes gleamed behind his spectacles. "We're all specimens of human credulity and hope. Even the skeptics, especially the skeptics, provide valuable data." Clara noticed Mr. Crane check his watch again. 9:15. Mrs. Winters had noticed too. "Mr. Crane, you seem rather preoccupied with the time. Have you another engagement this evening?" Crane flustered visibly. "No, forgive me, it's merely that Mrs. Pettigrew must take her sleeping draught by 10 o'clock. Doctor's orders. Her grief. The insomnia has been terrible." Mrs. Pettigrew waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, pish posh, one night won't hurt. I intend to stay until Harold comes through. I can feel him near, Mr. Crane. He's trying to reach me." "But, Mrs. Pettigrew, the doctor insisted—" Crane's voice carried an edge of urgency. "The doctor isn't here, is he?" Mrs. Pettigrew's tone turned firm, almost sharp. "And neither is Harold. But tonight Harold might be. I'm staying until the very end, Mr. Crane. You may leave, if you wish." Of course I'll stay with you." Clara noticed his knuckles go white as he gripped his watch before returning it to his pocket. The doorbell rang once more and the room fell silent. Mrs. Penfield's eyes sparkled with anticipation. That will be her. Madame Seraphina Vale. The woman who entered was everything a medium should be. Flowing purple robes, dark hair swept up with silver combs, and enough jewellery to stock a small shop. She moved with practised grace, her skirts whispering across the floor, carrying an ornate wooden box that she cradled like a baby. But Clara saw the moment of hesitation when their eyes met. "You're the Wetherly woman?" Madame Seraphina's carefully modulated voice cracked slightly. "The one who solved that unfortunate business?" "I assist occasionally with certain matters," Clara replied carefully. From his perch on the mantelpiece, Marmalade's ears pricked forward. his golden eyes fixed on the medium with an intensity Clara recognised, the same focused attention he gave to particularly suspicious visitors at the shop. Madame Seraphina recovered her composure quickly, setting her box on the side table with reverent care. "I've brought the sacred tools necessary for tonight's communion." She opened the box, revealing its contents with theatrical flair. Tarot cards blessed by a Romanian mystic, a crystal ball from the mines of Brazil, and this... She lifted an ornate dagger with a handle of carved bone. An authentic ritual athame, a ceremonial dagger used to cut through the veil between worlds. Miss Collins gasped with delight. "Oh, just like in the Brighton Séance murders. The medium had a special blade for..." She caught Clara's look and subsided, though her pencil never stopped moving. "This blade," Madame Seraphina continued, apparently oblivious to the interruption, "has been in my family for generations. It channels spiritual energy and protects against malevolent forces." She set it carefully on the table that had been prepared for the séance, a round table covered in black cloth with 10 chairs arranged around it. "Now," Madame Seraphina said, producing a small velvet purse from within her robes, "before we commune with the spirits, there is the matter of payment. A guinea each, as Mrs. Penfield arranged. The spirits require proper compensation for their efforts." Mrs. Penfield approached with her reticule. "Of course, Madame Seraphina." "A guinea, as we agreed." She counted out 21 shillings and dropped them into the velvet purse with a musical clink. One by one the other guests followed. Mrs. Pettigrew paid without hesitation, her grief making her generous. The Colonel grimly produced his guinea, his expression suggesting he considered it money wasted. Miss Harwick's hands trembled as she counted out her coins, her thin purse nearly empty after. Mrs. Winters approached last among the ladies, counting out her 21 shillings with careful precision. "A guinea is steep, Madame Seraphina. That's a week's wages for many." "Contact with the beyond comes at a price, madam." Madame Seraphina's smile was serene as she tucked the now heavy purse back into the folds of her robes. "One cannot summon the dead for coppers." Dr. Waverley paid while simultaneously lecturing about the economics of spiritualism. Mr. Crane's hand shook slightly as he counted out his coins, and Clara noticed him glance at Mrs. Pettigrew's purse with an expression she couldn't quite read. 9 guineas, Madame Seraphina said with satisfaction, patting the purse. "The spirits will be most cooperative tonight." Dr. Waverley leaned in to examine the ceremonial dagger with professional interest. "Fascinating. The metal appears to be high-quality steel. The edge is remarkably keen for a ceremonial object." "It must be sharp to cut through deception," Madame Seraphina said, and Clara could have sworn she looked directly at Mr. Crane when she said it. Clara watched Crane pull out his watch yet again. From her angle she could see the clock face, 9:20. "Now then," Madame Seraphina addressed the room with the confidence of a seasoned performer, "before we begin, I must explain the rules. When we form the circle, we must all join hands. No matter what occurs, no matter what you see or hear or feel, you must not break the circle. The spirits are powerful on All Hallows Eve, and a broken circle can invite unfortunate consequences." "What sort of consequences?" Miss Harwick asked in a trembling voice. Madame Seraphina's smile was mysterious. "The kind best avoided, my dear." "Just like the phantom of Fairfax Manor," Mrs. Winters whispered loudly to Clara. "The circle broke and terrible things happened." "Shall we begin to arrange ourselves?" Madame Seraphina suggested. "The energies must flow properly." She began directing people to specific chairs with the authority of a general positioning troops. "Colonel Blackwood, you must sit to my left. Military discipline grounds the spiritual energies. Mr. Crane, to my right, where the financial energies gather. Mrs. Pettigrew, beside Mr. Crane. He'll provide you support." Clara noticed Crane's reluctance as he took his assigned seat. His fingers drummed against his leg in that same nervous pattern. "Miss Harwick, across from me. Your youthful energy will balance the circle. Dr. Waverley, to her left. Your scientific presence grounds us. Mrs. Penfield, as our hostess, you anchor beside the Colonel." She gestured to the remaining ladies. "Mrs. Winters beside Mrs. Penfield, and Miss Collins next to her, though perhaps leave your notebook aside for the actual séance." Miss Collins clutched her notebook protectively, but took her assigned seat. She continued arranging them until only Clara remained standing. "And Miss Wetherly, directly across from me. Your scepticism will actually help. It provides balance against those who believe too easily." Clara took her seat, noting that Madame Seraphina had positioned her where they could watch each other throughout the séance. "Interesting." Marmalade jumped down from the mantelpiece and disappeared beneath the table at the centre of the circle. "Perfect." Madame Seraphina surveyed her arrangement. "Now I must prepare the sacred space." She moved around the table, lighting candles and murmuring what sounded like Latin, but probably wasn't. The ceremonial dagger glinted in the candlelight as she used it to trace symbols in the air. "But first," she said, returning to stand behind her chair, "I'm already receiving impressions. The spirits are gathering early tonight, eager to communicate." She closed her eyes, swaying slightly. "They have messages for several of you." She moved behind Miss Harwick's chair, not quite touching the young woman's shoulders. "A broken engagement, but not by your choice, was it?" He chose another. "Someone of better standing." Miss Harwick gasped, her face draining of colour. "How could you possibly... The spirits see all, my dear." Madame Seraphina glided to Dr. Waverley. "And you, Doctor. You seek scientific proof of the spiritual realm, to vindicate a decision that cost you dearly. A woman, a politician's wife, perhaps." Dr. Waverley's pompous demeanour cracked. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "The spirits suggest nothing. They simply know." She moved to Colonel Blackwood. "India still haunts you, Colonel. The men who didn't come home. You blame yourself, though the fever was beyond anyone's control." The Colonel's military bearing faltered. That's not possible. No one knows about..." "The dead know everything," Madame Seraphina said softly. She approached Mrs. Pettigrew, her voice becoming gentle. "Harold is here, my dear. He worries about your welfare, about the finances. He says someone close to you isn't what they seem." Mrs. Pettigrew clutched at Crane's hand. "Harold? Truly?" Madame Seraphina moved behind Crane's chair. "The spirits are drawn to you. They speak of numbers, so many numbers. They see ledgers that don't balance, accounts that hide the truth. Harold says, the books tell lies, but the dead know what's missing." She paused, tilting her head as if listening. "He says to tell you the truth always surfaces, though I'm not certain what that means." Crane managed a tight smile. "Mr. Pettigrew was always concerned with accuracy." But Clara noticed his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuff. Finally, Madame Seraphina approached Clara. "And you, Miss Wetherly. Your grandmother stands behind you even now. I feel her presence strongly. She wants you to know she's always watching over you, especially here, especially tonight." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, certainty. She knew Genevieve's presence like she knew her own heartbeat. The particular weight of the air when her grandmother was near, the subtle scent of lavender water that came from nowhere, the way certain objects seemed to shift slightly, pages turning in, the gilded leaf without any breeze. Her grandmother's ghost was many things, but she was not here. Not in this room, not tonight. This woman was lying. But how did she know so much about everyone else? "The spirits are very active tonight," Madame Seraphina announced, returning to her place. "We must begin soon, while the veil remains thin." The clock on the mantel began to chime, 9:30. "When the lights are extinguished," Madame Seraphina intoned, "do not be afraid. The spirits communicate through darkness. They will make their presence known." The first bell of St. Giles began to toll in the distance, its bronze voice carrying through the fog. "The 7 bells," Madame Seraphina whispered. 7 bells to mark the thinning of the veil. By the 7th bell the spirits will be among us." The 2nd bell tolled. She took her seat, spreading her hands on the table. The ceremonial dagger lay before her, its blade catching the candlelight. She picked it up, holding it vertically with the point facing upward. "This blade will guide the spirits to us. Join hands, form the circle." The 3rd bell. Clara felt Mrs. Penfield's soft hand in her right, Mrs. Winters's trembling fingers in her left. Around the table the circle formed, 10 people connected by touch and anticipation. The 4th bell. The candles flickered, the temperature seemed to drop. "They're coming," Madame Seraphina whispered. "Can you feel them gathering?" Clara felt nothing but Mrs. Winter's increasingly sweaty palm and the vibration of Marmalade's purr against her ankle. But around the table she saw the others lean forward, caught in the medium's spell. The gas lights began to dim, a gradual fade that had to be mechanical but seemed supernatural in the moment. "Whatever happens," Madame Seraphina's voice was barely audible now, "do not let go." The lights continued to fade, shadows creeping across the table like living things. Clara caught a glimpse of Mr. Crane's face in the dying light, pale, sweating, his free hand twitching toward his pocket watch one more time. Then darkness swallowed them all. Chapter 3. The darkness was absolute. Clara felt Mrs. Penfield's soft fingers in her right hand, Mrs. Winters's damp palm in her left. Around the table, the breathing of 10 people created an intimate rhythm in the blackness, some quick and nervous, others deliberately controlled. "The spirits are here," Madame Seraphina's voice floated through the void, somehow seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Harold Pettigrew, we call to you. Your beloved wife seeks your presence." A sob escaped Mrs. Pettigrew. Clara heard Crane murmur something comforting. The 5th bell of St. Giles tolled, its bronze voice carrying strangely through the fog, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Harold comes forward." Seraphina's voice had taken on a strange, deeper quality. "He has messages for you all. He sees everything from beyond the veil, every secret, every lie, every stolen moment." Clara felt the temperature drop, or perhaps it was just her imagination. In the darkness, sensation became unreliable. "He speaks first to his beloved wife," Seraphina's voice trembled. "He says, 'My darling, the blue cameo. He wants you to know about the blue cameo in the 2nd drawer of the escritoire. You thought it was lost.'" Mrs. Pettigrew gasped. "The cameo! I searched everywhere. How could you possibly—" "He also mentions the Thornfield ball. He says he forgives you for the incident with the blue dress." "But Harold never attended the Thornfield ball," Mrs. Pettigrew said, confused. "He was in Brighton that weekend for business." Seraphina's voice continued quickly, covering the mistake. "Of course he sees all from beyond. He speaks now of many things. Thursday evenings at Morrison's club. Someone named Jenkins who disappointed him, accounts that troubled him before his passing." She paused, her voice changing, becoming more personal. "He sees troubling matters, accounts that don't reconcile. Someone in this room has betrayed trust. The numbers dance and lie." Clara heard several sharp intakes of breath around the table, impossible to tell whose in the darkness. "Harold says the truth will surface," Seraphina continued, her voice rising dramatically. "Promises broken to multiple souls, debts unpaid, and someone here who takes what isn't theirs." That's when everything went to hell. Something crashed onto the table. Clara heard the scatter of cards, the roll of what must have been the crystal ball, the clatter of multiple objects hitting the floor. A furry body, Marmalade, it had to be, landed directly on the table, sending everything flying. Clara heard metal scraping, the ceremonial dagger clattering across the table as it was apparently knocked from Seraphina's hand. Multiple people screamed. Chairs scraped back. The circle broke instantly as hands released in shock. "My spectacles!" Miss Collins cried out. "Don't break the circle." Seraphina's voice had lost all theatrical quality, becoming sharp with real panic. "No, don't!" "Something touched me!" Miss Harwick shrieked. Clara heard fabric rustling, a chair falling over, someone stumbling. The distinctive sound of heavy wood hitting the floor, a chair overturning completely. Mrs. Winters was praying loudly. Colonel Blackwood barked military commands that no one followed. The chaos swelled. Clara heard fabric tearing, someone had caught their sleeve on something. The table itself shifted, scraping across the floor with a sound like a wounded animal. To Clara's right, she heard sudden movement, fabric rustling violently, chairs scraping. Someone was struggling, but in the chaos, it was impossible to tell who or where exactly. Clara stood but kept one hand on her chair, trying to maintain some sense of position in the absolute darkness. She heard Marmalade yowl, his battle cry when truly offended, and more crashes as he apparently leaped from the table to somewhere else, knocking over what sounded like a candlestick in the process. "Stay where you are!" Clara called out, but her voice was lost in the pandemonium. Someone bumped into her. She smelled pipe tobacco and pomade, probably Dr. Waverley. Someone else was sobbing. Glass broke somewhere to her left. The screaming continued, multiple voices now, overlapping, panicked. Clara tried to count seconds in her head but lost track immediately. 10 seconds, 15. The darkness made time elastic, unreliable. Another crash, something heavy toppling, more fabric rustling. Footsteps, or was that just chairs scraping? The sounds blurred together into chaos. Through it all, she heard movement that seemed different from the panic, purposeful, deliberate. But in the darkness and chaos, it was impossible to tell who or where or what. Mrs. Pettigrew was calling for Mr. Crane. Miss Harwick continued to shriek. The Colonel was still shouting orders. Then the 7th bell began to toll. Its deep bronze voice cut through the chaos like a blade. For one suspended moment, everyone seemed to freeze, as if the bell itself commanded silence. "The Vale," Seraphina's voice came from the darkness, weak now, struggling. "The 7th bell. The Vale is thinnest." A gasp, sharp, surprised. Then a strange, wet sound like fabric being punctured. A soft moan, then nothing. The 7th bell's echo faded into terrible silence. "The lights!" Mrs. Penfield's voice broke the spell. "Someone light the lights!" Clara heard fumbling, the strike of a match. The first candle flame seemed brilliant after the absolute darkness. Dr. Waverley stood by the mantelpiece, lighting candles with shaking hands. Mrs. Penfield found the gas key and turned it, bringing up the jets slowly. As light returned to the room, Clara's eyes struggled to adjust. The séance table was askew, its black cloth pulled half off. Cards littered the floor. The crystal ball had rolled under a chair. Miss Collins was on her hands and knees searching for her spectacles, her notebook clutched to her chest, even in her panic. Mrs. Winters stood pressed against the wall, clutching her reticule like a shield. Clara noticed immediately that several people were not where they'd started. Colonel Blackwood's chair lay on its side. Dr. Waverley stood by the fireplace, far from his original seat. Miss Harwick had somehow ended up near the curtains, a piece of dark fabric torn and hanging from where she'd grabbed it. Even Mr. Crane seemed to be one chair over from where he'd begun. And Madame Seraphina Vale sat slumped forward in her chair, unnaturally still, the ornate ceremonial dagger protruding from just below her ribs. "Thank God that's over," Colonel Blackwood said, straightening his jacket. Madame Seraphina, I hope you're satisfied with your theatrical—" He stopped. They all saw it at the same moment. The handle of the ornate ceremonial dagger protruded from Seraphina's torso, blood spreading across the purple fabric of her robes. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. "Is she—" Mrs. Pettigrew's voice was barely a whisper. "Is she all right? Someone help her!" Dr. Waverley rushed forward, his medical training overcoming shock. He felt for a pulse at her throat, lifted her head gently. "She's dead," he announced quietly. The room erupted. Miss Harwick screamed, a high, keening sound that went on until Mrs. Winters slapped her. Mrs. Pettigrew swayed, and Crane caught her before she could fall. "No, no, no," she kept saying. "This can't be happening. Not at my séance." Then, more quietly, "But Harold wasn't at Thornfield. How did she get that wrong?" Miss Collins, having found her spectacles, stood frozen, still clutching her notebook. "Just like the Brighton séance murders," she whispered. "The medium died first. I said she would. I wrote it down. I predicted—" Her voice rose hysterically. "Quiet!" Colonel Blackwood commanded, moving toward the door. "This is a crime scene. I'll fetch the constables immediately." Clara stepped in front of him, blocking her path. "No one leaves this room." "Miss Wetherly, you cannot possibly—" "The killer is in this room, Colonel." Clara's voice cut through the growing hysteria. "Someone here stood up in the darkness, took that blade, and murdered her. If anyone leaves, we lose our chance to find them." "This is preposterous," Dr. Waverley blustered. "We're not criminals to be detained like—" "One of us is," Clara said simply. The room fell silent except for Mrs. Pettigrew's quiet sobbing. "But we were all holding hands," Miss Harwick said tremulously. "We were in a circle. How could anyone—" "The circle broke when my cat jumped on the table," Clara said. "In that chaos, someone acted." Mr. Crane's face was grey. "This is false imprisonment. You have no authority—" "Then leave," Clara said, stepping aside from the door. "Explain to the constables why you fled a murder scene." "I'm sure that won't look suspicious at all." No one moved. Mrs. Penfield, white-faced but resolute, rang for Jenny. When the maid appeared and screamed at the sight, Mrs. Penfield grabbed her firmly by the shoulders. "Jenny, listen carefully. You are to go directly to Scotland Yard. Find Inspector Graham Redgrave. Tell him Miss Clara Wetherly needs him urgently at my residence. Tell him—" she glanced at the body— "tell him there's been a death. Now go quickly and speak to no one else." Jenny fled. "We should move her," Dr. Waverley suggested. "Lay her down properly." "No," Clara said firmly. "Nothing must be touched. The inspector will need to see everything exactly as it is." "We can't just leave her like that," Mrs. Winters protested. "It's not decent." "Murder isn't decent," Clara replied. She looked around the room at the assembled suspects, for that's what they all were now. Someone here had used the cover of darkness and chaos to commit murder. Someone here had struggled with Seraphina for that blade. The overturned chair, the torn curtain, the scattered positions, all evidence of that terrible moment. But who and why? Marmalade sat on the mantelpiece, washing his paw with studied indifference. Whatever had caused him to leap onto that table had set in motion a chain of events that ended in death. The seventh bell's echo had long since faded, leaving only the sound of the clock ticking and Miss Collins's pencil scratching in her notebook. She'd begun documenting everything, muttering about predictions and first murders as she wrote. Madame Seraphina Vale had conducted her last séance, and someone in this room had made quite certain of that.
Marmalade's observations, in which humans scream about the obvious while missing the important. The dead woman was no surprise. She'd reeked of doom since arrival, that particular mix of greed and fear that never ends well. Why did I leap onto that table? My business entirely. Perhaps the tablecloth offended me. Perhaps something needed scattering. Perhaps it was the scraping sound, metal against wood, barely audible. Someone reaching for that blade with my Clara sitting so near, in the dark where she couldn't see the threat? Absolutely not. Not that I'd admit to protecting her. I simply felt the sudden need to investigate the table. Vigorously, with all four paws. The amusing part was how quickly they all fell apart afterward. One moment holding hands like kittens in a basket, the next stumbling about shrieking. The darkness didn't bother me naturally. I could see perfectly well, which is how I know at least 3 humans ended up in entirely wrong places, and one of them was rather pleased about it. But did anyone ask the cat? Of course not. Too busy having hysterics, Clara would sort it out eventually. She usually managed despite her limitations. In the meantime, I had a perfect view from the mantelpiece and no intention of sharing my observations. After all, where's the entertainment in solving things quickly?
Chapter 4. The silence that followed Clara's declaration stretched taut as piano wire. 9 people stood frozen, each eyeing the others with newfound suspicion. The corpse in the chair had transformed them all from séance participants into murder suspects. "This is absurd!" Dr. Wetherly finally blustered, breaking the spell. "We cannot simply stand about with her sitting there like that." "The doctor's right," Colonel Blackwood said, recovering his military bearing. "We should check if she's truly beyond help." Dr. Wetherly approached the body cautiously, reaching for her wrist to check for a pulse. His fingers found nothing. He placed his ear near her mouth, listening for breath that didn't come. "She's dead," he confirmed, stepping back quickly. "Quite dead." "We can't stay in here," Mrs. Penfield gasped, her hand at her throat. "We simply can't remain in this room with her." "Everyone to the parlour," Colonel Blackwood commanded, already moving toward the door. "This is a crime scene now." "Wait," Clara said, "we should—" But the exodus had already begun. Mrs. Winters fled first, followed quickly by Miss Harwick, who was whimpering. Dr. Wetherly ushered Mrs. Pettigrew out, supporting her as she swayed. Within moments, everyone had retreated to the parlour, leaving only Clara and Marmalade with the body. Clara took one last look at the séance room, the overturned chairs, the scattered cards. Madame Seraphina still slumped forward in her chair, with that terrible blade protruding from her torso. Then she too retreated, closing the door behind her. In the parlour the panic was palpable. 9 people pressed themselves into various corners of the room, as far from each other as the space allowed. "We should document how she was found," Dr. Wetherly said, attempting to reassert his scientific authority. "Before memories fade." "Oh, I've been sketching everything." Miss Collins held up her notebook, revealing a rather wonky diagram of the table and stick figures. "See? Here's where everyone was sitting, and here's poor Madame Seraphina, and—" "That looks nothing like the actual arrangement," Colonel Blackwood observed. "It's representational," Miss Collins said defensively. "Perhaps we should photograph the scene," Dr. Wetherly suggested. "Very modern, very scientific." "An excellent idea," Mrs. Winters agreed. "Who has a camera?" They all looked at each other. "Well, surely someone," Dr. Wetherly began. "They cost a fortune," Mrs. Penfield said, "and they're enormous. Hardly something one carries to a séance." As they bickered about documentation, Clara noticed something more concerning. People were beginning to eye each other with increasing suspicion. "You were awfully quick to take charge, Miss Wetherly," Dr. Wetherly said suddenly, turning his attention to Clara. "Almost as if you expected something to happen." "I beg your pardon." "And you knew exactly who to send for," he continued, warming to his theme. "This Inspector Redgrave. How convenient." "Inspector Redgrave investigated the Barrett murder," Mrs. Penfield said sharply. "Everyone knows Clara assisted with that case." "Assisted?" Dr. Wetherly's eyebrows rose. "Or was she a suspect then too?" "How dare you?" Mrs. Winters stepped forward. "Clara would never—" "Her cat caused the chaos," Miss Harwick said, her voice thin with hysteria. "If that beast hadn't jumped on the table, the circle wouldn't have broken." All eyes turned to Marmalade, who was grooming his tail with supreme indifference. "You can't seriously be suggesting my cat is an accomplice to murder," Clara said. "In the telltale twitch," Miss Collins said suddenly. "The killer always has a nervous tic. We should observe everyone for involuntary movements." Immediately, everyone became hyper-aware of their own bodies. Mr. Crane's hand moved toward his pocket watch, then jerked back. Miss Harwick twisted her handkerchief. Colonel Blackwood cleared his throat. Dr. Waverley adjusted his spectacles. "There!" Mrs. Winters pointed at Mr. Crane. "He's checking the time again." "I always check the time," Crane protested, though sweat beaded on his forehead. "It's a habit, nothing more." "The guilty party perspires," Miss Collins announced, scribbling frantically. "It says so in sweat of fear." "We're all perspiring," Colonel Blackwood said. "It's a warm room and we've just witnessed a murder." "Speaking of which," Clara interjected, trying to regain control, "we should determine where everyone was when the lights came back on." "Capital idea," Miss Collins exclaimed. "We must recreate the crime, just like in The Murderer's Return. Everyone back to your positions." "Back in there," Miss Harwick's voice rose to near hysteria. "With her!" "We can't go back in that room," Mrs. Winters said firmly. "Not until the police arrive." "Then we'll have to remember from here," Clara said. "Try to recall where you were sitting and where you ended up." What followed was pandemonium. Everyone claimed a different chair. Arguments broke out over who had been sitting where. Miss Collins attempted to draw a floor plan, declaring that spatial relationships are crucial to understanding the crime. "I was definitely in my original seat," Dr. Waverley said confidently. "No, you were by the fireplace when the lights came on," Mrs. Winters corrected. "I saw you there." "That's impossible. I never left my chair." "Your chair was next to mine," Colonel Blackwood said, "and you weren't there when I stood up." "Standing up?" Clara asked sharply. "Your chair was overturned, Colonel." The Colonel's face reddened. "I stood when the chaos began. The chair must have fallen after." "Or during," Clara suggested, "while you were moving through the darkness." "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm observing that your chair was knocked over and you were not near it when the lights returned." "This is intolerable." The Colonel's military bearing stiffened further. "I won't be interrogated by a shopkeeper." "Would you prefer to be interrogated by the police?" Clara asked mildly. "At least they have actual authority." "Then you're welcome to wait outside for them," Clara said, gesturing to the door. No one moved. "Did anyone notice blood?" Clara asked suddenly. "On themselves or others?" "Blood." Miss Harwick went even paler. "There was blood on the curtains in the séance room," Mrs. Winters said. "I saw it when the lights came on. A smear on the dark fabric." "Did you touch it?" "Certainly not. Miss Harwick, you were by the curtains when the lights came back. Did you see it?" Miss Harwick examined her hands frantically. "No! No blood on me. I grabbed the curtains to steady myself, but I didn't. There was no blood then." "Then someone else touched them after," Clara mused. "Someone who had blood on their hands from the incident." "Check everyone's hands," Mrs. Winters demanded. Another round of frantic examination followed. No one showed any cuts, though several people had small bruises from stumbling in the dark. "We should check for bloodstains on cuffs," Miss Collins suggested. "In Blood Will Tell, the killer is caught because—" "These aren't your penny dreadfuls," Dr. Waverley snapped. "This is real life." "And yet," Miss Collins said with surprising dignity, "I predicted the medium would die first, didn't I? Just like in the Brighton Séance murders. And she did." The room fell silent. "You did say that," Mrs. Winters said slowly. "You said it right when she arrived." Everyone turned to look at Miss Collins, who suddenly seemed to realise the implications. I was just commenting on the story," she protested. "It's a common trope in séance mysteries." "How wonderfully convenient," Dr. Waverley said. "You predict a murder and then it happens." "That's absurd. I wouldn't. You were crawling on the floor in the dark, someone pointed out. You could have been anywhere. I was looking for my spectacles. I can't see without them. So you claim, the Colonel said. This is ridiculous, Mrs. Penfield intervened. Miss Collins wouldn't hurt a fly. She reads about murders. She doesn't commit them. Perhaps that's where she gets her ideas, Dr. Waverley suggested darkly. Miss Collins had gone very pale. She clutched her notebook to her chest like armour, then suddenly gasped. Wait, I've just remembered something terrible. What now? Mrs. Winters asked. Miss Collins's voice rose with genuine fear. In the Brighton Séance murders, the medium wasn't the only victim. She was just the first. Everyone froze. The killer strikes again before midnight, Miss Collins continued, her eyes wide behind her spectacles. We have less than 2 hours, and one of us... She looked around the room at each terrified face. One of us is next. But that's just a story, Mrs. Winters protested. I predicted the medium would die, didn't I? And she did. Miss Collins was becoming hysterical. What if I'm right about this too? The room erupted in panic. Everyone began backing away from everyone else. Accusations flew. Mrs. Pettigrew started sobbing again. Mr. Crane pulled out his watch with shaking hands. It was nearly 10:30. That's when the knock came at the door. Everyone screamed. Chapter 5. The knock came again, harder this time. Open this door immediately. The voice was male, authoritative and decidedly irritated. No one moved. 9 people remained frozen in place, each as far from the others as the room's dimensions would allow. Miss Collins clutched her notebook like a shield. Mrs. Pettigrew had pressed herself into a corner. Even Colonel Blackwood, for all his military bearing, seemed reluctant to approach the door. It could be the killer, Miss Harwick whispered. Return to claim the next victim. The killer is already in this room, Clara reminded them, though she too felt a flutter of unease. The pounding resumed. Mrs. Penfield, Miss Wetherly, I received an urgent summons about a death. If someone doesn't open this door in the next 10 seconds, I'm summoning the constables to break it down. That sounds like Inspector Redgrave, Mrs. Penfield ventured. How do we know it's really him? Mrs. Winters asked. In the counterfeit constable, the killer pretended to be... Oh, for heaven's sake! The voice had lost all pretense of professional composure. Because I'm asking you to open the bloody door. It's raining. I've been dragged from my home at past 10 o'clock, and I'm in no mood for games. That's definitely him, Clara said, moving toward the door. Wait, Miss Collins cried. What if it's a clever impersonation? Clara ignored her and opened the door. Inspector Graham Redgrave stood on the threshold, water dripping from his hat, his hazel eyes sharp with annoyance that shifted immediately to concern when he saw Clara's expression. Behind him rain had begun to fall in earnest, turning the fog into a dreary mist. Miss Wetherly. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the parlour in one sharp assessment. Everyone pressed against walls, no body in sight, the general air of barely contained hysteria. Is there any corner of London where you don't stumble over the dead? Despite everything, Clara felt her lips twitch. Only the ones too dull to interest them, Inspector? Apparently so. His expression hardened as he took in the scene properly. Where is the body? The séance room, Clara said quickly. We left her there and retreated here. You left the scene undisturbed. For once he sounded almost approving. Good. No one else touches anything. Is that understood? He addressed the room at large, and 9 heads nodded rapidly. He removed his wet coat with controlled movements, hanging it on the stand with the precision of a man who needed order in chaos. Miss Wetherly, you'll come with me to examine the scene. The rest of you stay exactly where you are. She's a suspect too, Dr. Waverley protested. Why should she... Because she's the only one with sense enough to preserve a crime scene, Redgrave cut him off, and I need someone who witnessed the original arrangement. Clara followed him toward the séance room, and naturally Marmalade padded after them, tail high. "Your cat as well," Redgrave muttered. "Why am I not surprised?" They entered the drawing room. Redgrave stopped in the doorway, taking in the chaos. Overturned chairs, cards scattered everywhere, the crystal ball on the floor, and the table askew with its black cloth half pulled off. "Was this chaos from the incident or after?" he asked. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Marmalade jumped on the table during the séance, in the darkness. That's what started everything. Your cat is making a habit of complicating my crime scenes, Miss Wetherly." But there was a hint of something almost like amusement in his tone. Redgrave approached the body carefully. Madame Seraphina Vale sat slumped forward in her chair, the ceremonial dagger protruding from her torso. He studied the wound, the angle of entry, her position for a long moment, then let out a slow breath through his nose. "Mary Wickham," he said quietly, more to himself than to Clara. "Who?" Clara asked, confused. "Her name is Madame Seraphina Vale." "No, it isn't." He examined the blade without touching it. This entered from below, angled upward. Unusual for an attack, he moved around the body, studying it from different angles. "And she's still holding something in her left hand." Clara looked closer. A few threads of black fabric were caught in the woman's clenched fingers. "We'll need to check everyone's clothing," Redgrave said. He crouched lower, examining the folds of her robes. "What's this?" A small velvet purse had fallen from her skirts, landing on the floor beside the chair. He picked it up carefully, testing its weight. The coins inside clinked softly. "Heavy," he observed, opening it to count quickly. "Tonight's collection, I assume." She charged a guinea per head, payment in advance. "A week's wages for many." Redgrave's voice held distaste as he tucked the purse into his coat pocket. Then he noticed the curtains. "Blood there. Someone touched them after." "Miss Harwick was near the curtains when the lights returned," Clara offered. "Noted." He stood, surveying the room once more. "Back to the parlour. I have questions for everyone." They returned to find the group exactly as they'd left them, though somehow seeming to have pressed even further into their respective corners. Marmalade immediately leaped onto the mantelpiece, assuming his supervisory position. Redgrave positioned himself where he could see everyone at once. His stance was that of a man ready for anything, feet apart, shoulders squared, coat pushed back slightly to keep his hands free. "Listen carefully, because I'll say this once," he announced, his voice cutting through the nervous whispers. "The woman you knew as Madame Seraphina Vale was a fraud." Her real name was Mary Wickham, confidence trickster, former actress, and recently released from Newgate after serving 6 months for fraud. The room erupted. "A fraud!" Mrs. Winters exclaimed. "Worse than that!" Redgrave's gaze swept the room. "A blackmailer! These people gather dirt on their marks, then squeeze them dry." "But she knew things," Mrs. Pettigrew's voice broke. "About Harold, about the blue cameo. She said Harold was here, speaking through her." "These people are skilled at gathering information," the Colonel said gruffly, though his face was red with embarrassment. "Research their marks beforehand." "Precisely," Redgrave's tone was sharp. "Which means one of you had more to lose than the others." Dr. Waverley attempted to recover his dignity, though I must say I had my suspicions. "You did not," Mrs. Winters snapped. "You were as taken in as the rest of us." "Just like in the fraudulent fortune teller," Miss Collins exclaimed, scribbling frantically. "The medium researches everyone beforehand." Mrs. Pettigrew sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. Harold wasn't here at all. It was all lies. "Focus on what matters now," Redgrave said curtly. "I need facts, not feelings. Where everyone was positioned. What happened when the lights went out? Who moved where?" "We were trying to work that out before you arrived," Clara said. "But everyone remembers differently. The weapon," Redgrave said, changing tack. "Where did it come from?" "Her ritual dagger," Miss Collins said. "She showed it to us before the séance." "Her own blade." "Interesting." His eyes narrowed as he processed this information. As Redgrave continued his questioning, Marmalade decided to make his own contribution to the investigation. He leaped from the mantelpiece onto a side table, sending several items tumbling to the floor, including a black beaded reticule. "Oh!" Mrs. Penfield exclaimed. "That's her bag, Miss Wickham's." "Your cat is destroying evidence again, Miss Wetherly," Redgrave said dryly, but he was already moving toward the spilled contents. The reticule had opened in the fall, spilling its contents across the carpet. Clara knelt to gather the items, but stopped short as she realised what she was looking at. Papers. Dozens of small, folded papers. Redgrave was beside her in an instant, snatching up one of the papers before anyone else could move. Nobody touched these. He unfolded it, his expression darkening. Blackmail material. Clara picked up another. Victoria Harwick. Engagement broken. Timothy Ashwood chose Lydia Pemberton instead. Father lost fortune in railway speculation. Miss Harwick burst into tears. Mrs. Penfield automatically handed her a handkerchief, then added, "Not on the upholstery, dear. The salt stains terribly. Colonel R. Blackwood. Fever outbreak in regiment, India, 1854. 12 men died. Court of inquiry. Cleared, but questions remain." The colonel's face went purple. That was cleared. Completely exonerated. The fever came from bad water. Nothing to do with... "In my drawing room where the bishop took tea," Mrs. Penfield wailed. "Dr. Josiah Waverley, seen at Claridge's with Mrs. Margaret Thornbury, wife of Member of Parliament Thornbury." "This is outrageous," Waverley blustered. "Medical consultations. Mrs. Thornbury suffers from nervous complaints." "Very private medical consultations," the colonel said dryly. Clara continued searching through the papers. "There's information here on everyone. Mrs. Penfield's second cousin's scandal, Mrs. Winters's husband's bankruptcy, Miss Collins's rejected manuscripts, detailed notes about Mrs. Pettigrew's estate and Harold's habits." Clara noticed one more paper had fallen near her foot. She retrieved it, unfolded it, and read aloud with as much composure as she could muster. "Miss Clara Wetherly, frequent late-night visits to Scotland Yard, private consultations with Inspector Redgrave, most inappropriate for an unmarried woman." She looked up to find Redgrave watching her, his expression unreadable. "Well," Dr. Waverley said, with a hint of relief at no longer being the centre of attention, "that does seem rather irregular. A young woman alone at all hours—" "Oh, do be quiet, Josiah," Mrs. Penfield snapped. "Clara's been helping with investigations for months. We all know about it. She walks across the street to my house afterward for tea. Hardly scandalous. Unlike some people's Claridge's arrangements," Mrs. Winters added pointedly. Dr. Waverley's face reddened. "Miss Wetherly's botanical knowledge has been invaluable to several investigations," Redgrave said, holding out his hand. Clara gave him the paper, and he pocketed it. "All consultations have been conducted professionally." The slight stretch of truth hung in the air. They both knew some late-night discussions had lingered longer than strictly necessary. But Mrs. Penfield was already nodding. "Of course they were," she said firmly. "Now, can we focus on the actual murder in my drawing room rather than Clara's perfectly respectable work?" Clara found one last paper on the floor near Mrs. Penfield's chair. Agatha Penfield's second cousin, Mr. Reginald Penfield, embezzled from his employer in Manchester. "My cousin!" Mrs. Penfield was outraged. "Not even me personally. This is an insult. Am I not worth blackmailing?" "Wait," Clara frowned, looking through the scattered papers. "Inspector, there's nothing here about Mr. Crane." "Well, that makes sense," Mrs. Pettigrew said, wiping her tears. "I only asked Mr. Crane to accompany me this afternoon, after Mrs. Turner fell ill. He wasn't supposed to be here originally." So, Miss Wickham wouldn't have researched him. Redgrave's attention shifted briefly to Crane, then away. No blackmail material means no motive. Lucky for you, Mr. Crane. Crane gave a weak smile. I suppose so. Dr. Waverley observed. Rather eliminates him as a suspect, doesn't it? The rest of us had secrets she could exploit. Perhaps, Redgrave said curtly. Now then, I need everyone back in the drawing room. We're going to sit exactly where you were during the séance. We're going to establish who could have reached the victim. Back in there? Miss Harwick whimpered. With her? The body won't hurt you, Redgrave said flatly. The killer might. Shall we? As they reluctantly filed toward the drawing room, arguing about who sat where, Clara noticed Redgrave watching everyone carefully, his gaze sharp and assessing. The clock chimed the half hour, 10:30. In the Brighton Séance murders, Miss Collins said in a small voice, the killer strikes again before midnight. Redgrave's jaw clenched. Sit down, Miss Collins. This isn't one of your penny dreadfuls. But Clara saw his hand move instinctively toward his coat pocket, and his eyes flicked to the clock. The room felt smaller suddenly, the shadows deeper. 9 suspects, 1 killer, and an hour and a half until midnight.
Marmalade's observations, in which the humans finally bring someone sensible and I provide assistance they don't deserve. The inspector had arrived. Finally. Someone who didn't smell of penny dreadful fantasies and imagined ticks. He and Clara made a decent hunting pair, though their courtship dance was painful to observe. All that circling and not touching. Humans complicated everything. A simple head bonk would have settled matters, but no, they had to pine and pretend. Following them to the drawing room was necessary. Someone had to supervise. The inspector poked about the dead woman, making obvious observations. Yes, the blade was there. Yes, she was dead. Brilliant deduction. Though at least he didn't try to move her about like the others wanted to. Everyone smelled wrong tonight. Feared as that, changes the usual scent patterns, makes everyone smell like prey. But underneath the fear, other scents lingered. The military man's old gunpowder and fresh sweat. The weepy widow's sour grief mixed with something sharper. Anger, perhaps, or guilt. The pompous doctor kept touching his collar like it was too tight, leaving damp fingerprints on the fabric. The young desperate woman wore perfume that couldn't quite mask desperation. The dead woman's reticule had been interesting before I knocked it over. She'd kept checking it during the séance, the way hunters check their weapons, even bad hunters. The inspector blamed me for destroying evidence, as if. The reticule needed investigating, and clearly no one else was going to do it properly. If important things fall out when I happen to walk past, perhaps they should secure their evidence better. When the papers scattered, the humans reacted in telling ways. The young woman crawled under the table to retrieve hers. Genuine panic. The doctor tried to step on his before anyone could read it. Calculated guilt. The military man went very still, the kind of still that means violence is being considered. The weepy widow clutched hers to her chest. Protective desperation. The papers themselves told stories the humans missed. Different inks, some fresh, some aged. The dead woman had been collecting secrets for a long time. Patient, methodical, like a cat watching a mouse hole. The inspector noticed everything, of course. That's his job. He was already calculating who sat where, who could reach whom in the dark. His eyes moved constantly, cataloguing positions, distances, possibilities. The Collins woman kept shrieking about penny dreadfuls. If she mentioned one more ridiculous title, I might have to knock her spectacles under the furniture. Again. Though I had to admit the clock ticking toward midnight did add a certain atmosphere. Not that I cared about human dramatics. I had more important concerns. Like the fact that Clara had forgotten my dinner, and the unfortunate reality that Mrs. Penfield's house smelled entirely too much like lavender and not nearly enough like fish. Clara would sort it out eventually. She usually managed, despite her limitations. In the meantime, I had a perfect view from the mantelpiece and no intention of sharing my observations. After all, where's the entertainment in solving things quickly?
Chapter 6. Everyone filed back into the drawing room reluctantly, but stopped short at the threshold. The body still sat slumped in its chair at the séance table. "We can't," Miss Harwick's voice broke. "We can't sit here with her like that." "She's right," Mrs. Penfield said, her usual bluster subdued. It's not decent, not civilised." Redgrave nodded curtly. "Dr. Waverley, Colonel Blackwood, the parlour sofa if you would. Carefully, touch nothing else." The two men approached the body with visible reluctance. As they carefully lifted her, the ceremonial dagger still grotesquely in place, Mrs. Penfield brought her best embroidered tablecloth. "Even in death, dignity matters," she murmured, covering the woman who had tried to blackmail them all. "My mother would have insisted." Within minutes, the body lay in the parlour, properly covered. They returned to the drawing room, which now seemed both better and worse. The chair where Mary Wickham had died stood empty, a grim reminder. The overturned furniture, the blood-stained curtains, the scattered cards, all evidence of violence remained. But at least they could think without a corpse watching them. "I've sent word for the police surgeon," Redgrave said once everyone had assembled again. "He'll examine the body and confirm cause of death. Officially, though that's rather obvious, the coroner will make his determination tomorrow. For tonight, we establish who had the means and opportunity." Mrs. Penfield sank into a chair, staring at the empty seat where the victim had died. "I cannot believe this is happening," she said, her voice smaller now. "A murder in my drawing room, where the bishop took tea." She looked around at the ruined space. "And now everyone knows about Reginald's embezzlement. The neighbours will be insufferable." "Mrs. Penfield," Redgrave said with strained patience, "we have more immediate concerns than your cousin's crimes. It's my reputation that's ruined." Her voice rose again, grief and indignation mixing. 40 years of respectable entertaining, and now I'll be Murder Penfield for the rest of my days. My mother would rise from her grave. "Speaking of which," Mrs. Winters said nervously, "you mentioned blood on the curtains earlier, Inspector. Should we examine them more closely?" "An excellent suggestion." Redgrave moved toward the windows. "Everyone, gather here, carefully." They crowded around the curtains where Mrs. Winters had spotted the smear. In the gaslight, the dark stain was clearly visible on the pale damask. "Someone touched these after getting blood on their hands," Clara observed, studying the pattern. "The smear is horizontal, as if someone reached out to steady themselves." "Or to wipe their hands clean," Redgrave said grimly. He turned back to the body, examining it more closely. "There are threads caught in her hand." Black fabric. He held them up to the light. "Fine weave. Wool, possibly silk blend." "Which means," Colonel Blackwood asked, "which means the victim grabbed at someone's clothing during the struggle." Redgrave looked around the room. "Everyone, I need to examine your clothing, looking for tears, missing threads, or blood." "Our clothing?" Mrs. Pettigrew asked faintly. "Starting with those who were seated closest to the victim." His gaze settled on the Colonel. "Your jacket, Colonel Blackwood." The Colonel stiffened. "This is preposterous. You were sitting directly beside her. You had the best position to reach her in the darkness, military training for efficient action, and the most damaging secret to protect." "I didn't..." The Colonel's face reddened. "Your jacket!" Reluctantly, the Colonel removed his jacket. There was indeed a small tear near the cuff, though no blood was visible on the fabric itself. "Caught it on the chair when I stood," he said quickly. "During the chaos." Redgrave examined the fabric closely, comparing it to the threads in the victim's hand. His expression remained neutral. "The weave doesn't match. Your wool is too coarse." He turned the jacket over, inspecting the sleeves and lapels more carefully. Then his gaze dropped. "Your shoes, Colonel?" The Colonel looked down. In the gaslight, dark stains were visible on the leather of his right shoe, unmistakably blood. "For Christ's sake," the Colonel burst out, I helped carry the woman to the parlour." "Of course there's blood on my shoes." Redgrave nodded slowly. A reasonable explanation. But he made a note in his small book regardless. He moved systematically through the room. Dr. Waverley's black waistcoat, similar weave, possible match. Redgrave's eyes narrowed as he examined the doctor's coat more closely. "Your sleeve, Doctor?" Dr. Waverley glanced down at his left sleeve where a dark stain marked the black fabric, so dark it had gone unnoticed in the dim gaslight. His face paled slightly. I examined her immediately," he said quickly. "Checked for a pulse. My medical training. One act without thinking. I must have." He trailed off, staring at the blood as if seeing it for the first time. "You checked her pulse," Redgrave said, making another note. "Where?" "Her throat. The carotid artery. Standard procedure." "And you touched the wound?" "No! I would never!" Dr. Waverley's voice rose with indignation. "I'm a physician. I know better than to disturb evidence. Yet you have blood on your sleeve." "Transfer from checking her pulse, obviously. The blood was everywhere by then." Redgrave said nothing, simply made another note. Dr. Waverley's face flushed with barely suppressed outrage. Mr. Crane's black wool suit, also possible. Redgrave examined Crane's jacket with the same meticulous attention. His gaze caught on the left cuff. "Mr. Crane, your left sleeve." Crane looked down. Small drops of blood marked the black fabric near his wrist. 3 distinct spots, dark against the wool. "I ... Crane's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was sitting so close to her. It could have splashed there. When it happened." Clara studied Crane's position in her mind. He'd been sitting to Mary Wickham's left, which meant his right sleeve would have been closest to the victim, not his left. Blood on his left cuff was harder to explain, though splash patterns could be unpredictable in the chaos of violence. Still, Crane's explanation was plausible. Miss Harwick's black dress, comparable fabric. Redgrave stepped closer, examining her black dress and hands carefully. A tiny speck of blood marked her collar, barely visible. "Miss Harwick," he said quietly, "your collar." Miss Harwick's hand flew to her throat. "The curtains! I touched them. There was blood on them, and I didn't realise." Redgrave studied the small spot. "If you'd touched the body, there would be considerably more." Miss Harwick sagged with relief, though tears continued streaming down her face. Mrs. Pettigrew wore full mourning black. Mrs. Winters had a black shawl draped over her shoulders. Miss Collins's dark grey dress appeared nearly black in the gaslight. Even Mrs. Penfield's black dress had similar fabric. "Half of London wears black," Mrs. Penfield observed. "It's practically required for anyone respectable." Redgrave's expression darkened as he held up the threads again. "She's right." The threads prove the killer wore black, which narrows it down to almost everyone in the room. He glanced at his notes. "And the blood evidence is similarly inconclusive. Dr. Waverley examined the victim. The Colonel helped move her. Mr. Crane sat beside her. Miss Harwick touched the blood-stained curtain. All have plausible explanations." "But how did the blood get on the curtain?" Clara asked, studying the horizontal smear again. "Someone reached out and touched it. But who? And when?" Redgrave met her eyes. "An excellent question. One we may need to answer before we understand what truly happened." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Waverley shifted away from the Colonel slightly. Miss Harwick clutched her handkerchief tighter. Crane stared at the blood spots on his cuff as if they might provide answers. "Let's think logically," Dr. Waverley announced, attempting to recover some authority. "Some of us had weaker motives than others." "Mr. Crane had no blackmail material at all," the Colonel said quickly. "He wasn't even supposed to be here tonight." "Neither did Mrs. Penfield," Mrs. Winters added. "Her cousin's scandal is hardly personal." And our embarrassments pale beside real scandals, Mrs. Turner said, gesturing to herself, Mrs. Winters, and Miss Collins. Rejected manuscripts and correspondence with doctors hardly seem worth killing over. So that narrows it to those with truly damaging secrets, Dr. Waverley concluded. The Colonel's military disaster, Miss Harwick's desperate financial situation, and your affair with Mrs. Thornbury, the Colonel said bluntly. That could destroy your practice, Josiah. Dr. Waverley's face flushed. That's hardly... The most damaging secrets belong to you three, Mrs. Winters observed. The rest of us would survive our embarrassments. You three would be ruined. But motive isn't everything, Clara interjected quietly. Position matters. Who could physically reach the victim in the darkness? The Colonel was right beside her, Miss Collins pointed out. So was Mr. Crane, according to the Colonel, Mrs. Pettigrew said. And several of us were close enough in the chaos, Dr. Waverley added. When chairs are overturning and people are stumbling about in complete darkness, proximity becomes difficult to establish with certainty. Precisely, Redgrave said. No one is eliminated based solely on lack of blackmail material or claimed position. The physical evidence suggests violent movement by multiple people. I've been documenting everything in my notebook, Miss Collins said, clutching it protectively. All the inconsistencies I've noticed. What inconsistencies? Dr. Waverley demanded, his tone sharp. Miss Collins consulted her pages. Well, Dr. Waverley claimed he never left his chair, but I distinctly noted you were by the fireplace when the lights returned. The Colonel's chair was violently overturned, suggesting struggle or rapid movement. Miss Harwick ended up by the curtains where the blood appeared, though she was seated across the table, and Mr. Crane kept checking his watch at odd intervals throughout the evening, during the séance, after the murder, even now. 4 people visibly stiffened. You've been spying on us, the Colonel blustered. I've been observing, Miss Collins said with surprising dignity. In murder investigations, the smallest detail might make innocent people look guilty, Dr. Waverley interrupted. Or reveal who actually is guilty, Redgrave said quietly. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. 4 suspects now knew they were under particular scrutiny. Enough! Redgrave's voice cut through the rising arguments. Everyone return to your exact positions from the séance. Now! You were by the fireplace, Dr. Waverley pointed at the Colonel. No, you were by the fireplace, the Colonel retorted. I was by the window, Miss Harwick said. That's where I was, Mrs. Turner protested. Miss Collins tried to diagram the positions in her notebook while people kept moving. Please, everyone stay still. You're confusing my documentation. Everyone freeze, Mrs. Penfield commanded. You're muddling the evidence. In the confusion, Clara noticed several people seemed genuinely uncertain about their positions. Dr. Waverley claimed 3 different chairs. Miss Harwick kept changing her mind about where she'd been. Even Mr. Crane seemed confused, though he eventually settled into a seat with apparent certainty. Marmalade chose that moment to leap onto the séance table, then deliberately moved from chair to chair, settling briefly in each one as if testing them. Even the cat's confused about where he was, Dr. Waverley said. The cat's not confused, Clara said. He knows exactly what he's doing. Redgrave was watching everyone carefully. Colonel Blackwood, you claim you were here, next to the victim. Yet your chair was found overturned. I stood when the chaos began, the Colonel insisted. The chair must have fallen then. Or during a struggle, Redgrave suggested. Dr. Waverley, you were found by the fireplace, which is directly behind where the victim sat. You would have had to pass behind her chair to reach that position, yet you claim you never left your seat. Dr. Waverley's face reddened. I may have stood in the confusion. One loses track in complete darkness. I certainly didn't move intentionally toward a... Miss Harwick, Redgrave continued, not letting Waverley finish. You were seated 2 chairs away from the victim, close enough to reach her if you stood and moved during the chaos. Yet you were found by the curtains on the opposite side of the room. I was trying to find the door, Miss Harwick protested. I was frightened. And Mr. Crane, Redgrave turned to him, the Colonel says you were seated on the victim's other side. You keep checking your pocket watch. Why? Crane's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket before he caught himself. Mrs. Pettigrew's sleeping draught. I need to ensure she takes it at the proper time for her health. It's past my usual hour already, Mrs. Pettigrew confirmed, though she looked at Crane with some confusion. Though I don't see why you're so concerned about it tonight, Mr. Crane. Surely solving a murder takes precedence over my sleeping schedule. Crane said nothing, but his face had gone pale. While they argued, Clara knelt by the body again, studying the wound more carefully. Something about it troubled her. Inspector, she said quietly, drawing him aside, the angle of entry troubles me. It's upward, but not forceful, more consistent with movement during a struggle than a deliberate, calculated strike. You think it might have been unintentional. I think the physical evidence doesn't match premeditated murder. Someone panicked in the darkness, there was a struggle, and the blade went in. She glanced at the assembled suspects. Several people have lied about their positions or movements. Any one of them could have been closer to the victim than they're admitting. Which means we're looking for someone who's terrified rather than coldly calculating, Redgrave said, his gaze moving across the room. Someone who made a terrible mistake and doesn't know how to undo it. The clock chimed 11, 1 hour until midnight. In the Brighton Séance murders, Miss Collins whispered. The second murder happens before midnight. There won't be a second murder, Mrs. Penfield said firmly, because I am not having another corpse in my drawing room. 1 per evening is my absolute limit. There won't be a second murder, Redgrave said with authority that brooked no argument, because I'm here now, and we're going to solve this before anyone else gets hurt. You can guarantee that? Mrs. Pettigrew asked tremulously. I can guarantee that anyone who attempts violence will deeply regret it, Redgrave said, his hand moving to his coat pocket in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely unarmed. Now, we're going to reconstruct exactly what happened. Everyone will return to their precise positions. Reconstruct? Mrs. Penfield's voice rose to a pitch that threatened the crystal chandelier. You mean do it all again? More blood on my carpets? More chaos in my home? The killer is still here, Mrs. Penfield. Would you prefer they escape? Mrs. Penfield drew herself up to her full, if modest, height. Absolutely not. No murderer leaves my home without being caught. I have standards. My mother would rise from her grave if I let a killer escape from a Penfield gathering. She surveyed her ruined drawing room, the blood-stained curtains, the marked carpet, the overturned chairs, the scattered blackmail papers now in Redgrave's possession. "Should I serve tea?" she asked plaintively. "Is it appropriate to offer refreshments when there's a corpse in one's drawing room? What's the etiquette for murder investigations?" "Just sit down, Mrs. Penfield," Clara said gently. "Where?" "Not in the death chair. I'm having that burned." "It's evidence," Redgrave reminded her. "Then I'm billing Scotland Yard for new furniture." "And the cleaning, and possibly a priest to cleanse the room." Despite the chaos, Clara noticed the dynamic had shifted. 4 people were now under intense scrutiny. Colonel Blackwood with his military scandal and overturned chair, Dr. Waverley with his affair and unexplained position change, Miss Harwick with her financial desperation and proximity to the blood-stained curtain, and Mr. Crane with his nervous watch-checking and visible anxiety. The ladies of Bloomsbury had effectively been cleared, though they watched the proceedings with keen interest. Mrs. Pettigrew seemed too grief-stricken and confused to be suspected. Mrs. Penfield was too short to have inflicted the wound at that angle, as Redgrave had noted. But which of the 4 remaining suspects had actually committed the act? And had it been murder or a terrible accident? Right then, Redgrave said, his tone suggesting he'd had quite enough of the theatrical hysteria. Let's discover who killed Mary Wickham and Mrs. Penfield. Yes, Inspector. No more commentary about your furniture. But my carpets... Mrs. Penfield. She pursed her lips. Fine, but I'm starting a murder victims household restoration fund first thing tomorrow. This must happen to other people. Miss Collins perked up. Actually, in the blood-stained banister. Miss Collins. Sorry. The clock ticked toward midnight. 60 minutes to catch a killer, Miss Collins breathed. Several people groaned audibly. Clara studied the 4 primary suspects, but something nagged at her. The wound angle, the threads, the overturned chair, the blood on the curtains at exactly the height of someone reaching out to steady themselves, the blood evidence that explained so much and yet so little, transfer from examination, from moving the body, from sitting too close, from touching stained fabric. This didn't feel like murder, it felt like panic. She glanced at Redgrave and found him watching her, a question in his eyes. She gave a small shake of her head. Not yet. She needed to see the reconstruction first. One of these 4 people had struggled with Mary Wickham in the darkness. One of them had felt the blade go in. One of them had blood that couldn't quite be explained away by reasonable circumstances. One of them had returned to their seat saying nothing, but had they meant to kill her, or had something gone terribly accidentally wrong? The pieces were there. She just needed to see how they fit together. And somewhere in this room, someone was desperately hoping they'd never discover the truth. Chapter 7. The clock's 11th chime faded into silence. 9 people stood in Mrs. Penfield's drawing room, as far from each other as the space allowed. The empty chair where Mary Wickham had died sat like an accusation at the séance table. The overturned furniture remained, Colonel Blackwood's chair on its side, cards scattered across the floor, the blood-stained curtains hanging in shadow. Right, Redgrave said, his tone brooking no argument. Everyone to the table. Sit exactly where you were during the séance. Exact positions, not approximations. But we've already tried that, Dr. Waverley protested. No one agrees on... Then we'll establish it properly. Redgrave's voice cut through the objection. Miss Wetherly was present for the entire séance. She'll direct you. All eyes turned to Clara. She moved to the table, studying the empty chairs arranged around it. The configuration was still clear in her mind. She'd observed everything carefully before the lights went out. Mrs. Penfield, Clara said, pointing to a chair. You were here to Miss Wickham's left. I was across from her, directly opposite. Mrs. Winters to my left, Miss Collins to my right. I don't remember sitting there, Dr. Waverley began. You were here, Clara said firmly, indicating the chair. Between Miss Collins and Colonel Blackwood, the Colonel was to Miss Wickham's immediate left. The Colonel's face darkened. I was not... You were, Colonel. I'm quite certain. Mr. Crane was on her other side, between her and Mrs. Penfield. Miss Harwick sat between Mrs. Winters and Mrs. Pettigrew, who was next to Mr. Crane. One by one she directed them to their exact positions. Some went reluctantly. Dr. Waverley kept insisting he'd been elsewhere. Mr. Crane's hands trembled as he took the seat directly beside where Mary had died. This is the configuration, Clara said to Redgrave. I'm certain of it. Redgrave studied the arrangement, then nodded. Join hands. We're going to experience the timeline exactly as it happened. In the dark, Mrs. Winters' voice trembled. Again? In the dark. Miss Wetherly will narrate the sequence. I need everyone to understand how fast this occurred, how little time there actually was. Clara found herself back in position, Mrs. Penfield's soft hand in her right, Mrs. Winters's damp palm in her left. Across from her, the empty chair gaped. Marmalade positioned himself on the bookshelf, amber eyes gleaming, watching everything. "When I extinguish the lights," Redgrave said from the gas fixtures, "stay exactly where you are. Hold hands. Do not let go. Do not move. Don't speak unless I tell you." 9 heads nodded. The gas jets began to dim. Shadows crept across the table. Clara caught glimpses of faces in the dying light, Dr. Waverley adjusting his spectacles nervously, Miss Harwick gripping her handkerchief, the Colonel's jaw clenched tight. Then darkness swallowed them all. For a moment, nothing but breathing. "The 5th bell had tolled," Clara said, her voice steady. "The lights were fully out." Miss Wickham was speaking. Clara paused. She mentioned broken promises, hidden affairs, accounts that don't balance, ledgers that hide the truth. In the darkness, someone's breath caught sharply. A moment of silence, then Mrs. Pettigrew's voice. "Mr. Crane, you're squeezing my fingers." Forgive me," Crane's voice came quickly. "I didn't realise." "The 6th bell began to toll," Clara continued. "Marmalade jumped onto the table." On cue, something thudded nearby. "Everything scattered," Clara said. "Oh, cards, the crystal ball, the ceremonial dagger. The circle broke. People screamed. Chairs overturning. Fabric tearing." In the darkness, restless shifting. Someone's breathing quickened. "Count with me," Clara said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The room fell silent except for her counting. 15, 16, 17, 18. The silence grew heavy. Someone shifted, chair scraping. 25, 26, 27. Someone's breathing had become rapid. "The 7th bell began to toll," Clara said quietly. In the darkness, someone gasped. "Miss Wickham spoke even through the chaos," Clara continued. "Does anyone remember what she said?" Silence. Then Miss Collins' small voice. "She said, 'The veil, the 7th bell, the veil is thinnest.'" "And that's when it happened," Mrs. Winters whispered. "When the veil was thinnest. Perhaps a spirit—" "That's ridiculous!" Dr. Waverley's voice came from the wrong direction. He'd moved. "Ghosts didn't kill her. A person did." "Then where are you, Doctor?" Redgrave's voice cut through darkness. "You've moved. I can hear it. I was disoriented." "Lights!" Redgrave commanded. The gas jets flared. Clara's eyes struggled to adjust. Dr. Waverley stood near the fireplace, exactly where he'd been found after the murder. His face flushed, breath fast. "I merely stood during the chaos." One loses all sense of direction in darkness. "You moved toward the victim's position," Redgrave observed. Again. Colonel Blackwood's chair had tipped during the reenactment as well. Miss Harwick had shifted toward the curtains. Multiple people had moved in the darkness. "Multiple people could have reached her," Redgrave said. "I need to examine the body again." "The blood pattern on those curtains, the victim touched them. But when? Miss Wetherly, you observed the wound. Come with me." To the room. "No one moves from this room. I'll be at the parlour door where I can see you all." Clara followed Redgrave to the parlour. He positioned himself at the doorway where he could see into the drawing room, then gestured her toward the body. "The curtain blood," he said quietly. "You noticed it first." Clara knelt beside the sofa. "Her right palm. There's blood here." Redgrave crouched beside her. "She touched the curtains after being wounded. Staggered there, left that smear, then made her way back to her chair." 15, perhaps 20 seconds, Clara said. "Long enough to grab at her attacker first." She indicated the threads. "The angle troubles me," Redgrave said, studying the wound. "Upward thrust, but not forceful." "Someone shorter," Clara said, "or someone who struck while seated and the victim was standing." They both straightened. "So," Redgrave said, voice low, 4 suspects with damaging secrets. The Colonel's my prime suspect. Military man, trained killer, sat right beside her. Too obvious, Clara countered, and his secret, whatever happened in India, was cleared by inquiry. He has official exoneration, which Mrs. Wickham would have revealed was questionable, Redgrave said. Court of inquiry cleared him, but she had information suggesting otherwise. That's worse than outright guilt. It's the appearance of corruption covering up negligence. You're reaching, Clara said. Dr. Waverley has far more to lose. An affair with an MP's wife? That's not just social ruin, that's political scandal. He could face charges. Waverley's a coward, Redgrave said dismissively. All bluster and pompous speeches. I don't see him acting decisively in darkness. Cowards are the most dangerous when cornered, Clara argued, and he moved during both séances. Claims disorientation, but he ended up in the exact same position, behind where she died. Rehearsing his movements, Redgrave admitted grudgingly, trying to seem innocent by repeating them. That's calculated. What about Miss Harwick? Clara asked. Desperate financial situation, broken engagement, father ruined. She needs to marry well or face poverty. She's too slight, Redgrave said. I don't see her overpowering. It wasn't overpowering, Clara interrupted. It was chaos. A blade, darkness, panic, physical strength doesn't matter. Redgrave considered this. Fair point, though her position was wrong, she was seated across the table. She ended up by the curtains somehow, Clara reminded him. People moved. And then there's Crane, Redgrave frowned. He bothers me most. Why? He had no blackmail material. He's the least likely. Exactly, Redgrave said. Everyone else had obvious motives. He had none, which makes him either completely innocent or hiding something we haven't discovered yet. You're being contrary, Clara said. I'm being thorough, Redgrave corrected. The obvious suspect is usually guilty, but not always. Sometimes the person with no apparent motive is the one who... He stopped. No, you're right. Without blackmail material, he has no reason. Unless Mrs. Wickham discovered something about him during the séance itself, Clara said slowly. Something she revealed in her threats that we didn't understand. Redgrave stared at her. Miss Wetherly, you're not seriously suggesting she actually spoke to the dead and discovered something about Crane, are you? His tone was sharp. That is the most preposterous thing I've heard tonight. Ghosts, spirits, this whole business is poppycock, and you know it. Clara hesitated. Inwardly, she wasn't so sure. She knew for certain that her grandmother somehow still inhabited the space at Hawthorne and Wetherly. Other mysterious things happened in her shop that defied logical explanation, but she was not about to tell the inspector that. No, of course not, she said firmly. I'm simply saying that perhaps she picked up on clues during the séance. Body language, a reaction, something quite explainable, Inspector. These confidence tricksters are skilled at reading people. Perhaps she noticed something about Crane in those moments before the lights went out. Redgrave's scepticism didn't entirely fade, but he nodded. That I could believe. Cold reading, they call it. Noticing small tells. They both fell silent, thinking. Well then, Inspector, Clara said, we shall do the same. We'll proclaim we know exactly who the killer is. Make them all nervous. Redgrave's eyes gleamed with understanding. Attack their secrets. See who reacts most strongly. Precisely, Clara said. If Mrs. Wickham could read tells in darkness, surely we can do so with the benefit of gaslight. You're learning, Redgrave said, almost smiling. Shall we rattle some cages, Miss Wetherly? After you, Inspector. They returned to find 8 people pressed into corners, as far from each other as possible. Redgrave positioned himself where he could see everyone. Miss Wetherly and I have examined the body. We've discussed the evidence, the wound angle, the blood pattern, the positions during the séance. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I believe we know who killed Mary Wickham." The room erupted in nervous exclamations. Several people shifted in their seats. Miss Harwick went even paler. The Colonel straightened his military bearing. Dr. Waverley adjusted his spectacles. "However," Clara said, stepping forward, "before we make an accusation, let's review what we know. Each of you had secrets Mary Wickham threatened to expose. Each of you had reason to silence her." She turned to Miss Harwick first. "Miss Harwick, your engagement was broken. Your father lost his fortune in railway speculation. You're desperate to marry well or face poverty. That's a powerful motive." Miss Harwick's hands twisted her handkerchief. "I would never, I couldn't." "You ended up by the blood-stained curtains when the lights returned," Clara continued. "You claim you were trying to find the door, but you were found in the exact spot where the victim touched the fabric after being wounded." "I didn't hurt anyone." Miss Harwick's voice rose to near hysteria. "Miss Wetherly," Redgrave said, his tone carrying weight, "Miss Harwick is slight. The wound angle we observed, upward thrust, suggests the killer was in front of the victim, likely standing. A shorter person or," he paused, "a woman of Miss Harwick's stature could have inflicted such a wound." Clara nodded slowly. "True, though I believe we're looking for someone with more decisiveness. Miss Harwick strikes me as someone who panics rather than acts." "I do panic," Miss Harwick said desperately. "I panicked in the darkness. That's why I was by the curtains. I was terrified." Clara's gaze moved to the Colonel. "Colonel Blackwood, your secret is perhaps the most damaging of all. India, 1854. 12 men dead from fever in your regiment. The court of inquiry cleared you, but Mary Wickham had information suggesting the verdict was questionable." The Colonel's face went purple. "I was exonerated. The fever came from the climate, miasma from the swamps." "But questions remain," Clara said quietly. "Questions about whether the camp should have been moved, whether proper ventilation was provided, whether 12 deaths could have been prevented with better command decisions." "You sat directly beside the victim," Redgrave added. "Military training for efficient, silent action. Your chair was found overturned, evidence of violent movement." "I stood during the chaos," the Colonel protested. "Any of us could have—" "You're trained to move in darkness," Redgrave pressed. "Trained to strike quickly and efficiently. 3 steps in absolute black, and you could have reached her." The Colonel's hands clenched into fists. "I did not kill that woman." "And yet," Clara said, "you had the means, the motive, and the position to do so." The room held its breath. The Colonel looked ready to explode. Then Clara turned to Dr. Waverley. "Dr. Waverley," she said, her voice taking on a different tone, "you've been very vocal about everyone else's secrets. Very quick to deflect attention from yourself. But you have secrets too, don't you?" Waverley's face flushed. "I've made no secret of the fact that Mrs. Thornbury is my patient. Medical consultations are hardly—" "An affair with the wife of an MP," Redgrave cut him off, "at Claridge's Hotel, Tuesday afternoons, private dining room. That's not a medical consultation, Doctor. That's political dynamite." "This is slander," Waverley blustered. "I'll have you know my professional conduct is above reproach." "Is it?" Clara asked quietly. "Mrs. Winters, didn't you mention something about your sister?" Mrs. Winters stepped forward, her voice cold. "My sister received a bill from Dr. Waverley last month. For a simple tonic and consultation, he'd quoted her 1 guinea. The bill was 3 guineas. "Medical supplies fluctuate in price," Waverley said quickly. "The accounting is complex. Sometimes the final bill seems higher than the initial estimate because the accounts don't balance," Mrs. Winters said. The room went absolutely silent. Everyone stared at Dr. Waverley. "That's what she said during the séance," Miss Collins whispered, her pencil frozen over her notebook. "Accounts that don't balance. Ledgers that hide the truth. She was talking about you, Clara said, watching Waverley's face carefully. Your medical billing practices. You've been overcharging vulnerable patients, widows, people who trust you, padding your bills, making the accounts not balance. This is preposterous. Waverley's voice had gone shrill. I run a respectable practice. My billing is ... Fraudulent, Redgrave said flatly. Mary Wickham researched you thoroughly. She knew about Mrs. Thornbury, and she knew about your billing fraud. When she spoke about accounts that don't balance, she was threatening to expose both. Dr. Waverley had gone pale. Even if she knew something about my billing practices, that doesn't mean I would never... You moved during both séances, Clara said. You claimed disorientation, but you ended up in the exact same position both times, behind where the victim died, as if you'd rehearsed your movements. You had 2 damaging secrets, Redgrave added. The affair could end your relationship with Mrs. Thornbury, but the billing fraud could end your career entirely. You'd lose your practice, face charges, possibly imprisonment. And when we examined the threads from the victim's hand, Clara continued, your silk waistcoat was remarkably similar. Fine black silk, high quality, very close to the sample. But not a match, Waverley cried. You said yourself the weave direction was wrong. Was it? Redgrave asked softly. Or did I simply not examine it closely enough in that moment? Waverley took a step backward. I want to leave. I'm not staying here to be... You're not going anywhere, Redgrave said, moving to block the door. This is false imprisonment. Waverley's voice rose. You have no right... It's him, the Colonel said, his voice certain. It has to be him. 2 secrets worth killing for, Mrs. Winters agreed. And he moved twice in the exact same way, Miss Collins added, scribbling frantically. Just like in The Calculated Killer, where the murderer rehearses. I didn't kill her, Waverley shouted. Yes, my billing practices may have been generous, and yes, I'm acquainted with Mrs. Thornbury, but I did not touch that woman. I didn't kill her. Then explain, Redgrave said coldly, why you moved toward her position during the séance. Explain why you're the one person whose threads nearly matched. Explain why her threat about fraudulent accounts was aimed directly at you. Waverley opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I don't know, but I didn't kill her. I swear to you, I didn't kill her. The clock began to strike, midnight. In the Brighton séance murders, Miss Collins said nervously, the second victim dies at midnight. Mrs. Winters turned to Redgrave urgently. Inspector, you must arrest him now, for all our safety. There's only 15 minutes until midnight. There won't be a second victim, Mrs. Penfield said firmly, because we've caught the killer. Haven't we, Inspector? Redgrave looked at Dr. Waverley, who stood trembling by the door, all his pompous dignity stripped away. Haven't we? Mrs. Penfield repeated, but Clara was watching the room, watching all of them. Dr. Waverley's terror seemed genuine, and yet the evidence pointed to him so clearly. The motive, the position, the threads, the victim's own words. Something didn't quite fit. But what?
Marmalade's observations, in which humans celebrate prematurely and I am forced to intervene. Wrong human. The pompous doctor pressed against the door, bleating protests. Genuine terror scent. The blind panic of prey wrongly cornered, not the calculated fear of a caught predator. Any cat could distinguish between the two. The other humans congratulated themselves. The Collins woman scribbled, probably composing something ridiculous. The Penfield woman calculated social advantage. The Winters woman nodded with grim satisfaction over her sister's medical bill. But the watch-checker sat motionless. Everyone else animated, talking, gesturing, exclaiming. Even the weepy widow had revived slightly, but the watch-checker had gone stone still. Guilt, fresh guilt, the raw kind that makes you forget to breathe. The pompous doctor's guilt was old, comfortable. Years of small justifications, routine fraud, but the watch-checker's guilt was new. Hours old, still bleeding. I stood, stretched. Humans never noticed a cat stretching. Padded to the watch checker. Saturday stared, his eyes flicked down, went wide, quickly away. Most humans couldn't resist a cat's stare. Instinctive. But the watch checker was too frightened to acknowledge my presence. His sleeve, torn, small gap where threads had pulled free, diagonal weave, identical to what the dead woman clutched. No one was looking at him. All eyes on the pompous doctor demanding solicitors. I placed one paw on the watch checker's torn sleeve. He flinched. Clara noticed. Her gaze moved. Me, the watch checker, his sleeve, eyes narrowing. Good. She was questioning her conclusion. The inspector still blocked the door. The others chattered about midnight and second victims. But Clara watched the watch checker now, watching him sit in terrible stillness while everyone else celebrated. She approached slowly, crouched beside me, studied the watch checker's sleeve in gaslight. The watch checker closed his eyes, as if not seeing prevented being seen. Typical. I returned to the mantelpiece, satisfied. Let Clara sort the rest. Someone had to actually solve the murder.
Chapter 8. The silence stretched. 9 people stared at Mr. Silas Crane, who sat motionless in his chair, staring at his hands. The torn sleeve of his jacket gaped where black threads had pulled free, threads that matched perfectly with those found clutched in Mary Wickham's hand. "Well?" Colonel Blackwood's voice cut through the quiet. "Explain yourself, man. Why would you kill her? She had no blackmail material on you." Crane didn't look up. His fingers trembled where they rested on the table. "Mr. Crane," Redgrave said, his tone measured but firm, "everyone in this room had secrets Mary Wickham threatened to expose. Everyone except you. You were a last-minute addition to the séance. She never had time to research you, yet the physical evidence proves you killed her. Why?" Still Crane said nothing. Clara moved closer, studying his face. Not defiance, not calculation, horror, the kind that came from terrible realization. "Mr. Crane," she said gently, "what did you think Mrs. Wickham was threatening to reveal?" His eyes flicked to hers, then away. "Tell us," Clara pressed. "You had no reason to fear her blackmail." "Unless," she paused, watching him carefully, "unless you thought you did." Mrs. Pettigrew rose from her chair, her voice shaking. "Silas, what is Miss Wetherly saying?" Crane flinched at her use of his Christian name. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Clara said quietly, "when did you last review your accounts in detail?" "My accounts?" Mrs. Pettigrew's confusion was evident. "Why, Mr. Crane manages all my financial matters. He's been wonderfully helpful since my dear Harold passed. Always so careful with the quarterly statements. The quarterly statements," Clara repeated. "Have you examined them yourself? Line by line?" Mrs. Pettigrew's face went pale. No, Mr. Crane always explained them so clearly. He said the banking terminology was confusing, that I needn't trouble myself with... How much should be in your accounts, Mrs. Pettigrew?" "Approximately £8,000, Mrs. Pettigrew said. "Harold left me quite comfortable, plus the dividends from..." "Mr. Crane," Redgrave interrupted, his voice sharp. "How much is actually there?" Crane's hands clenched into fists. "Mr. Crane," Redgrave repeated, "how much?" "Perhaps 2,000, Crane whispered. The room erupted. Mrs. Pettigrew swayed and Miss Harwick rushed to support her. Mrs. Winters gasped. The Colonel swore. £6,000, Mrs. Pettigrew breathed. "You took £6,000? "Nearly all of it," Crane said, his voice dead. "Over the past 18 months, small transfers, household expenses, investment opportunities, all carefully documented, all false." "But why?" Mrs. Pettigrew's voice broke. "I trusted you. Harold trusted you. We took you in when you had nothing." "I know." Crane finally looked up, his face haggard. "I know what you did for me. And I repaid your kindness with theft." Clara watched the exchange, pieces falling into place. Mrs. Wickham said something during the séance, something specific. Accounts that don't balance, ledgers that hide the truth. She turned to face the room. Everyone assumed she was speaking mystically. But she was being quite literal, wasn't she? She was threatening to expose fraud. She paused, her gaze moving between Dr. Waverley and Crane. Or did two men in this room hear those words and each assume she meant them? Dr. Waverley went silent, his earlier pompousness deflating. "Mr. Crane," Clara said softly, "when Mrs. Wickham spoke about fraudulent accounts, you thought she'd discovered your embezzlement. That's why you panicked." Crane nodded slowly, unable to speak. "But she never researched you," Clara continued. "You were a last-minute addition, invited only because Mrs. Pettigrew asked Mrs. Penfield if she might bring her financial advisor. Mrs. Wickham had no time to investigate you. She had no blackmail material on you whatsoever." She paused, letting the words sink in. When she spoke about accounts that don't balance, she was threatening Dr. Waverley's medical billing fraud, not your embezzlement. She didn't know about you at all. Crane stared at her. The colour drained from his face. She wasn't talking about me." Clara shook her head. The room held its breath. "I killed her for nothing," Crane whispered. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Pettigrew made a small sound, half sob, half gasp. "Tell us what happened," Redgrave said. "In the darkness." "Tell us exactly what happened." Crane's voice came out hollow, distant. The chaos started. That cat, it jumped on the table. Everything scattered. People were screaming, chairs overturning. He paused, swallowing hard. "I felt her stand up beside me. She was so close, right at my elbow. And those words, accounts that don't balance, ledgers that hide the truth, they were still ringing in my ears. I knew what I'd done. Every false entry, every forged signature, every lie I'd told Mrs. Pettigrew about where her money went." His hands trembled. "I was certain she'd discovered me. Certain she was about to denounce me in front of everyone. Everything I'd worked for, gone. Prison. Disgrace. I'd be ruined." "What did you do?" Clara asked gently. "I reached for her," Crane said, "in the darkness. I don't even know what I meant to do. Stop her from speaking, cover her mouth, push her away. I don't know." He touched his torn sleeve unconsciously. "We struggled. I felt something, the blade. She must have grabbed it when it fell from the table. I was trying to get it away from her, or she was trying to... I don't even know. It was dark. Everything was happening so fast, people shouting, furniture crashing." His voice cracked. "And then I felt it, the resistance, the blade going in. No one moved, no one spoke." "Her hand grabbed at my jacket," Crane continued, his voice breaking. "Clawed at me, I felt fabric tear. She pulled away from me, and then... nothing, just darkness and screaming. I couldn't see anything, couldn't see where she'd gone. I just sat back down and I waited." He looked up, his face ravaged. "When the lights came on, she was in her chair, dying, and I said nothing. I just sat there and let her die." Mrs. Pettigrew was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Crane looked at her with something like desperation. "I never meant to kill her. You have to believe me. I never meant..." "But you did," Mrs. Pettigrew said, her voice shaking. "You killed her. Because you stole from me. Because you thought your guilt was more important than her life." She stood trembling but resolute. "I would have forgiven the money, Silas. If you'd asked, if you'd explained, I would have helped you. Whatever debt you were in, whatever trouble you faced, I would have forgiven the money." Her voice hardened. "But that woman is dead because of what you stole, and I will never forgive that." Crane turned his gaze to Dr. Waverley, who stood pressed against the wall, his earlier pompousness completely stripped away. "I killed a woman," Crane said, his voice filled with something between hatred and despair, "because you were cheating your patients." Dr. Waverly opened his mouth, closed it. I never meant for anyone to," Waverly stammered. "It was just billing adjustments. Medical practice is expensive, the supplies, the consultation time. I merely adjusted the invoices to reflect the true cost of—" "You defrauded widows," Mrs. Winters said coldly. "Vulnerable people who trusted you." "It wasn't—" Waverly's voice faltered. It was just business." "It's called fraud, Josiah," Colonel Blackwood said. "Plain and simple fraud." Redgrave moved to the centre of the room, his presence commanding attention. "Mr. Silas Crane, you are under arrest for the murder of Mary Wickham. Dr. Josiah Waverly, you will answer charges of medical fraud." He gestured to the constables waiting at the door. "Take them both." "This is outrageous," Waverly protested. "I am a respected physician. You have no right to—" "I have every right," Redgrave said coldly. "Your billing fraud may not have wielded the blade, Doctor, but your crimes created the circumstances that led to murder. A woman is dead because Mr. Crane thought her threat was aimed at him instead of you." The constables moved forward. Dr. Waverly continued to bluster and protest, but Crane went quietly, his head bowed, all fight gone from him. As they reached the door, Crane stopped and looked back at Mrs. Pettigrew. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for all of it." "I'm so sorry." Mrs. Pettigrew turned away. The clock began to chime. "Midnight!" Miss Collins' hand flew to her mouth. "There won't be a second victim," Mrs. Winters said firmly. Mrs. Penfield straightened in her chair, rallying despite her exhaustion. "Real justice has been served, not the penny dreadful sort." The chimes continued. 1, 2, and 3, 4. Clara watched through the window as the constables led Crane and Waverly away into the November darkness. All Hallows Eve was ending. All Saints' Day would begin in moments. Redgrave came to stand beside her. "I was so focused on physical evidence," he said quietly. "The threads, the position, the wound. I would have arrested the wrong man based on the facts alone." Clara turned to look at him. "The physical evidence showed us who, but understanding why required seeing what drove him." "Guilty conscience," Redgrave said. He heard his own crime in her words, even though she meant someone else entirely. "Two men with fraudulent accounts," Clara observed. "Both panicked, but only one killed." "Because only one sat close enough to act on that panic." He paused. "I suppose I should thank you for preventing me from making a rather public arrest of the wrong man." "You're welcome, Inspector." "That wasn't actually gratitude, Miss Wetherly." "Wasn't it? How unfortunate. I was so hoping you'd learnt the concept." A brief silence then. "You realise this changes nothing. You're still a civilian with no official standing whatsoever. And you're still a detective who nearly arrested a man for being irritatingly pompous rather than actually murderous. Dr. Waverly is guilty of fraud, but not of murder. There is a distinction, I'm told." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Professional distinctions are important, Miss Wetherly." "I'll make a note of it, Inspector." A pause then. "Miss Wetherly," Redgrave said quietly. "Yes, Inspector?" "I seem to recall requesting that you avoid discovering corpses for the foreseeable future. Technically, I witnessed this murder rather than discovering the body afterward. A distinction I'm sure will comfort the magistrate." He paused. "This makes 4 cases, Miss Wetherly. 4 murders that found me, Inspector. I've been remarkably well behaved otherwise." "Have you?" His tone was dry, but there was warmth beneath it. "I suppose that depends on one's definition of well behaved. I use a very generous definition. I'd noticed," he almost smiled again, "perhaps murders simply, seek you out. A disturbing pattern." "Indeed." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter. Though I confess, your presence does make solving them considerably more interesting." It was the closest he'd come to an actual compliment. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "How very gracious, Inspector. I have my moments." They stood in silence as the last chime faded. His hand moved slightly, almost reaching for hers, then stopped. Professional distance reasserted, but something had changed. They both felt it. 12 bells had rung. Midnight had passed. All Hallows Eve was over. Behind them, the room slowly stirred back to life. Mrs. Penfield rallied, already calculating how to manage her reputation. The ladies gathered around Mrs. Pettigrew, offering comfort and practical support. Miss Collins continued scribbling, her penny dreadful practically writing itself. The killer had been caught, the truth revealed. But some betrayals, Clara knew, would take far longer than one night to heal. Chapter 9. The drawing room had begun to empty. Constables had taken Crane away in chains, his head bowed, all fight gone from him. Dr. Waverley had departed moments later, still protesting his innocence despite the evidence laid bare. The other guests were gathering their belongings, preparing to leave Mrs. Penfield's violated sanctuary. Redgrave withdrew the small velvet purse from his coat pocket. The coins inside clinked softly as he opened it, counting quickly. "Mrs. Wickham collected 9 guineas from each of you tonight," he said, holding up the purse. "Payment for her, services. She won't be needing them. You might as well recover what you paid for a fraud." A moment of surprised silence. Mrs. Winters stepped forward immediately. "Thank you, Inspector." "That's generous of you." Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated, her hand hovering near the offered coin. "It feels wrong somehow, taking money from the dead. Consider it restitution for being made accessories to murder, Mrs. Pettigrew," Redgrave said dryly. She accepted the guinea. Colonel Blackwood took his with a firm nod. "Good man, Redgrave." Miss Harwick's hand trembled as she accepted hers. The relief in her eyes suggested she needed it desperately. Redgrave turned to Clara, guinea extended. "I wasn't a paying guest, Inspector," Clara said quietly. He nodded and pocketed the remaining coin. Mrs. Penfield took hers last, managing a theatrical sigh. "I should refuse on principle. This was my gathering after all, but principle doesn't pay for new curtains, does it?" She tucked the guinea into her reticule with practical efficiency. Redgrave turned to Miss Collins, who remained at the séance table, scribbling furiously in her notebook. He held out the final guinea. She looked up, startled, then accepted it with a grateful nod before immediately returning to her notes. The scratching of her pencil filled the quiet spaces between murmured conversations. Mrs. Winters approached, eyes bright with interest. "You're certainly documenting this thoroughly, Miss Collins." "Researching your next penny dreadful." Miss Collins looked up, surprised but pleased. "Actually, yes. The sequence of events, the way the confession unfolded, it's better than anything I could invent." "I should think so," Mrs. Penfield said, moving closer. "Real murder is far more interesting than fictional ones. Now, about these novels you've been writing, you said 3 were rejected." Miss Collins nodded, some of her earlier embarrassment returning. "All 3. The publishers said they were either too sensational or not sensational enough, depending on which editor was reading." "Idiots!" Mrs. Winters declared. "I know editors at 3 of those houses," Mrs. Penfield said firmly. "I'll write letters." "After tonight's events, you have material for 12 novels. And now you have witnesses who can confirm you're not simply making things up." Miss Collins's face transformed. Hope, bright and sudden, replaced her earlier resignation. "Though perhaps change the names," Mrs. Winters added practically. "And locations." "Oh, certainly," Miss Collins was already mentally revising. "I was thinking of calling it The Spiritualist's Last Séance and setting it in Bath. The medium could be a French émigré, and instead of a cat causing the chaos, perhaps a trained monkey." "A monkey?" Clara couldn't help but smile. "For dramatic effect," Miss Collins explained earnestly, and the detective could be a retired naval captain with a wooden leg who... The ladies exchanged amused looks as Miss Collins continued outlining her revised plot. Mrs. Pettigrew rose unsteadily from her chair. She looked years older than she had at the séance's beginning. I should return home. Try to salvage what remains. Allow me to escort you, Mrs. Pettigrew. Colonel Blackwood stepped forward, offering his arm with grave courtesy. The streets aren't safe at this hour. Mrs. Pettigrew accepted gratefully. You're very kind, Colonel. The Colonel paused before Clara, his military bearing restored now that suspicion had been lifted. You pursued truth over convenience, Miss Wetherly. That takes courage. He tipped his hat and escorted Mrs. Pettigrew out into the November night. Miss Hurwick left quickly, relief evident in her hurried departure. She'd been cleared of suspicion, but wanted nothing more than to escape this house of horrors. Miss Collins reluctantly closed her notebook, still scribbling notes on the margins. I really must capture the exact sequence before I forget the details. The way the gaslight flickered when the confession came, the sound of the clock chiming midnight. Do try to sleep tonight, dear, Mrs. Winters said gently. Sleep? With all this material? But Miss Collins smiled as she departed, already lost in narrative possibilities. Soon only Clara, Redgrave, and Mrs. Penfield remained in the ruined drawing-room. Mrs. Penfield surveyed the damage with a critical eye. Overturned chairs, scattered tarot cards, the blood-stained curtains, candle wax melted into her carpet. Well, she said finally, tomorrow brings neighbours with questions. I suppose I'd best prepare suitable responses. You handled tonight admirably, Mrs. Penfield, Clara said. Did I? A woman died in my drawing-room, dear. I'm not certain admirably applies. You kept your composure. You provided crucial testimony. You hosted an investigation that brought a killer to justice. Mrs. Penfield considered this, her head tilting slightly. I suppose there is something to be said for that. The drawing-room where Miss Wetherly solved the Séance murder. That has a certain distinction, doesn't it? It does, Clara agreed, hiding her smile. Mrs. Penfield turned her attention to Redgrave. Inspector, do see Clara home safely. It's only across the street, but propriety matters. Of course, Mrs. Penfield. And do be careful, dear. Mrs. Penfield's gaze was pointed. November nights are quite cold. The subtext was clear. Everyone in Bloomsbury would know the inspector walked Clara home. Tongues would wag. Clara found she didn't particularly mind. They stepped out into the November fog. The gas lamps created halos of light along the empty street. All Hallows Eve had ended. All Saints' Day had begun in silence and mist. Marmalade materialized from the shadows, tail high, leading the way toward home with feline certainty. They walked in comfortable silence at first. Their footsteps echoed on the cobblestones. Mrs. Penfield will have this story circulating through Bloomsbury by tea-time tomorrow, Clara observed. Undoubtedly. The Séance murder. Miss Collins will probably steal the title. Redgrave's mouth twitched. I suspect she's already outlined 3 chapters. At least 3. They reached Clara's shop door. Marmalade darted inside as she unlocked it. Clara glanced through the window as she turned the key. 2 teacups sat on the small table, perfectly arranged on matching saucers with pink roses, her grandmother's favourite pattern. Redgrave followed her gaze and almost smiled. Your tea service appears ready, Miss Wetherly. So it does. Clara opened the door. It seems someone anticipated your visit, Inspector. Remarkably efficient household management. His tone was dry, carefully neutral on the subject of who might be managing her household. I've always thought so. It was their unspoken arrangement. He didn't question the mysteriously prepared tea. She didn't insist on supernatural explanations. The teacups appeared when he called. He accepted tea when offered. Neither examined the matter too closely. Clara stepped inside. Redgrave followed without hesitation. This, too, had become routine. Marmalade sat between the two teacups, tail wrapped around his paws, looking supremely satisfied with the evening's management.
Marmalade's observations, in which the ghost plays matchmaker and humans remain predictably oblivious. I watched from my position between the teacups as Clara and the inspector settled into their chairs. The inspector unbuttoned his coat, silver buttons catching lamplight as always, and hung it beside his hat on the rack. Settling in, then. Good. The ghost had outdone herself this time. She'd prepared the cups while we crossed the street. Ghost fast. I'd seen her shimmer through the window as we approached. Lavender scent, cold air, purpose, knowing what they didn't yet, that he'd stay. The veil was thin tonight. All Hallows Eve made ghosts bold, visible even to cats who usually only sensed their presence. I could see her clearly, selecting the rose-patterned cups, arranging them with deliberate care. Ghosts were useful that way. They could accomplish tasks without the limitations of corporeal form. Though honestly, if she'd simply appeared and told Clara to mate with the inspector, it would have been more efficient. But no, humans required elaborate rituals, mysterious tea services, plausible deniability, exhausting. The inspector was talking now. Something about tomorrow's formal statements. Clara laughed. Genuine, not her polite social laugh. Good. Progress. I began washing my paws. This would require patience. The ghost presence strengthened briefly. Temperature dropped. Her approval was palpable, which she'd done her part, set the stage, provided the excuse. Now it was up to the living. And of course, to me, superior feline intelligence would be necessary to shepherd these two through their obvious attraction. The inspector had proven adequate over these past 4 cases. Didn't try to pet without permission. Understood Clara's worth, showed proper respect. Most importantly, he made Clara laugh. The silver button man would make an acceptable mate. Not that either of them seemed to notice what was obvious to any cat, humans and their elaborate mating dances. Why not simply rub against each other's ankles and be done with it? The ghost's lavender scent faded slightly, satisfied perhaps that her interference had achieved its goal for tonight. I settled more comfortably between the teacups, tail wrapped around my paws in perfect feline composure. Territory secured, Clara safe, murder solved, matchmaking ghost properly encouraged, adequate male finally seated where he belonged. Until the next body appeared at our door, all was exactly as it should be. Though someone really ought to refill my food bowl. All this investigation work was hungry business, and humans were notoriously forgetful about feline needs when distracted by their mating rituals. I made a mental note to remind Clara, loudly, at dawn. For now I would supervise their tea time, ensure no improprieties occurred, maintain proper standards. After all, someone had to.
Chapter 10. The inspector placed his hat on his head, adjusting it with the careful precision that marked all his movements. The teacups sat empty between them on the table, the night grown impossibly late. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Wetherly." His formality had returned, though something warmer lingered beneath it. "I should let you get some sleep." "You're welcome, Inspector." Clara rose, following him to the door. "Though I suspect Mrs. Penfield will have the entire neighbourhood talking by noon." "Undoubtedly," the corner of his mouth twitched. "I've learned to accept that solving murders with you comes with certain social complications. A small price for justice. Indeed." He paused at the threshold as if he might say something more. Then, with a slight bow, he stepped out into the November fog. Clara watched until the mist swallowed him, then closed and locked the door. She turned and stopped. A single card lay on the floor beneath the shelf where her grandmother's tarot deck rested. It hadn't been there moments ago. She was certain of it. Clara bent and picked it up. The Knight of Swords. The image showed a knight in full armour, charging forward on a white horse, sword raised high against stormy clouds. His focus was absolute, his purpose clear. Nothing would deter him from his course. She turned the card over in her hands, studying the familiar worn edges of her grandmother's deck. Of all the cards to fall now, this one, action, intellect, the pursuit of truth, a swift and decisive nature. She thought of Redgrave walking into the fog, shoulders straight despite the long night, the way he'd cut through lies and misdirection with patient, methodical precision. His refusal to accept easy answers when the evidence pointed elsewhere. The Knight of Swords, indeed. Clara smiled and placed the card on the table beside the empty teacups. A message from her grandmother, as clear as any words. Pay attention to this one. He charges ahead with purpose, but whether that purpose led toward justice alone, or something more personal, remained to be seen. Clara moved to the window. The fog had thickened, and a full moon cast silver light through the mist, turning Bloomsbury's rooftops into ghostly shapes. All Hallows Eve had ended. All Saints' Day had begun, though London still slept. The night just past felt already distant, dreamlike, the séance, the murder, the confession. And yet it had been real, terribly, tragically real. She thought of Mary Wickham, who had made her living deceiving the desperate and the grieving. Victorian London was full of such frauds. Mediums who charged a guinea per head, a week's wages for many, to commune with the dead. Who used tricks and sleight of hand to convince bereaved mothers they could speak to lost children. Who exploited the one thing people could not bear, the finality of death. The spiritualist movement had swept through England like a fever. Maria Hayden had arrived from America just 5 years ago, and now mediums operated in every corner of London. The British Spiritualist Telegraph had begun publication this very year. Séances had become fashionable entertainment for the wealthy and desperate hope for the poor. Some believed genuinely, Clara knew. They needed to believe. The alternative, that death was simply an ending, that loved ones were gone forever, was too painful to accept. But others, like Mary Wickham, saw only opportunity, a chance to profit from grief. Clara understood both impulses. She knew her grandmother's presence in this shop was real, the moved objects, the opened books, the mysteriously prepared tea. She'd felt Genevieve's touch too many times to doubt it, but she also knew the difference between genuine mystery and calculated fraud. Mary Wickham had been a charlatan, a skilled one certainly. She'd researched her victims thoroughly, learned their secrets, wielded information like a blade, but a charlatan nonetheless. And yet, Silas Crane had killed her not because she'd actually discovered his embezzlement, but because his guilty conscience had made him hear threats where none existed. He'd murdered an innocent woman, well, innocent of knowing his crime at least, because he'd believed too readily in her supposed powers. There was irony in that. A fake medium killed by someone who half believed she was real. Clara turned from the window. Marmalade sat on the counter, grooming his whiskers with supreme unconcern. The chaos of the night meant nothing to him now. Order had been restored. His territory was secure. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" Clara said softly. "You always know." Marmalade paused in his grooming to give her a look of feline superiority that clearly said, "Of course I did. I'm a cat." Clara smiled despite her exhaustion. The shop would open late today, very late. She needed sleep, and she suspected most of Bloomsbury would be sleeping off the events of All Hallows Eve. Mrs. Penfield would be composing her version of events to share at tea. Miss Collins would be frantically revising her penny dreadful. Mrs. Winters would be calculating how best to use this scandal to her social advantage. And Inspector Redgrave would be filing his official report at Scotland Yard, reducing the night's drama to cold facts and witness statements. But here, in this quiet shop that smelled of dried herbs and beeswax, Clara felt the weight of what had truly happened. A woman had died. A man had killed her by accident and panic. Another man's fraud had created the circumstances. A widow had been betrayed by someone she'd trusted. Justice had been served, but justice didn't undo harm. It only ensured consequences. Clara picked up the Knight of Swords card again, studying the determined figure charging through the storm. Perhaps that was all anyone could do: charge forward, pursue truth, do what needed to be done despite the obstacles. And if, along the way, you found someone who charged forward with equal determination beside you, well, that was something worth paying attention to. Clara placed the card carefully back in the deck, but not before noting its position. The Knight of Swords would remember where it belonged, and so would she. Marmalade jumped down from the counter and padded toward the stairs, tail high, clearly ready for sleep now that order had been restored. Clara followed him up to her small apartment above the shop, her grandmother's presence a warm, approving weight in the air. Lavender and rosemary, love and remembrance. Outside, London slept in the deep hours between midnight and dawn. The living rested. The dead kept their vigil, or didn't, according to their natures. And somewhere in the fog, Inspector Redgrave walked home alone, his silver buttons catching the moonlight, his mind already turning toward the next case, the next truth that needed finding. The Knight of Swords, charging forward as he always did. Clara smiled as she climbed the stairs. Let him charge. She'd be ready when he returned.